The turn of the calendar year means a new set is rotating into the Revolution custom standard field in just a few weeks. Next month, we bid farewell to Awakening in Uldun, designed by Dodger, and say hello to Solastere, designed by the curator team's own Scribble. Solastere contains approximately 315 cards, and I've picked out just over 200 to talk about here today. With so much ground to cover, we're going to hop right in, so as always, links to the Custom Magic Discord server and relevant resources are in the description below, including links to the Lackey Bot and Escape from Limbo search engines tuned to show all the new cards from this set. As always, we'll start with mechanics, then new lands, and then break things down in color order. The set does have hybrid color cards added into the mix, so we'll cover those after the full gold cards, but before the colorless tools. Some final things to note before we begin. Every design we see here is subject to change as the curators and designer pick out cards that may need adjusting between the submission period and rotation. Additionally, you all may need to bear with me here. This is a crazy daunting task I have ahead of myself. As remains the case, I don't have an editing software I can run on my computer without causing some issues, so this video is recorded all in one take. I may have some verbal flubs, I may stumble over my script, I may go off script. I'll do what I can with the intense amount of card discussion we have ahead of us to make sure everything is easily navigable with timestamps for every section. I have to put a break between the black and red cards for my own well-being, so bear with me as I work my way through the card catalog we have to cover. Without further ado, let's dive into the review. Our first mechanic is a familiar one we both saw earlier this year and have also seen a couple times in official Magic: Adventure Spells. As always, Adventure is an instant and sorcery subtype found on permanent spells, usually, which you can cast as an adventure spell rather than the spell's normal casting cost to get the adventure spell and that effect, and then exile the card to be cast as the regular card later on for its regular casting cost. There are 40 adventure spells in Solastere across all 5 colors, with each mono color receiving 2 uncommons, 1 rare, and 1 mythic, while each color pairing has a common whose adventure costs hybrid mana, and a rare whose adventure costs both colors. Every adventure spell in Solastere is part of a creature card that costs 7 or more mana to cast and has the Spirit subtype, giving the set quite a lot of high-cost creatures to consider for deck building. The other returning mechanic from canon and from previous Revolution history are -1/-1 counters. As you'd expect, these counters function opposite to +1/+1 counters and cancel out with +1/+1 counters as a state-based action. There are also cards in Solastere with Wither, allowing them to deal damage to creatures in the form of -1/-1 counters. There are 11 cards with Wither innately across white, black, and red, a few cards that make tokens with Wither across white, red, and green, and 42 cards in the set overall that deal with -1/-1 counters in some fashion, with the majority either entering with -1/-1 counters or otherwise placing them on a creature you control when they enter, often removing those counters either as part of an activated ability or as a reward for meeting a condition. Up next, we've got a brand new mechanic in Syzygy, which lands as a bit of a hybrid between the Canon Convoke and the custom Flow ability from Kitsuo Dusk of Time. You can tap your other creatures as you cast a spell with Syzygy, or as you activate the ability of a permanent with Syzygy, and each of those creatures tapping this way pays for 1 generic mana. This gets around the most explosive component of Convoke, as you still have to pay any colored mana costs, but the activated ability hoop gives you a bit of extra benefit from cards that already reward you for going wide, and means any card with Syzygy will reasonably have an activated ability, so it will matter for activated ability synergies from Jiku Chaos Reigns, like Contest Coordinator, which we will talk about a lot throughout this review. Syzygy is also found across all 5 colors, in 21 total cards, with each color having 2 common, 1 uncommon, and 1 rare creature that features the ability, as well as a single uncommon equipment in Colorless. Last but not least are Chart Tokens, a new artifact token that you can sacrifice for 2 mana to reveal cards from the top of your library until you reveal a land, putting that land into your hand and the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. Chart tokens are, like everything else, found across all 5 colors on 27 different cards total, with each color getting 5 that can make them, while green gets a bonus land that makes charts, and white gets a removal spell that gives the opponent a chart. These are kind of treated similarly to clues in terms of their overall value, but it is worth noting that while it is more reliable than clues, you can always guarantee what card type you're drawing. You can never guarantee you'll draw anything other than a land. So the reliability is higher than clues, the strength is a little lower. Kicking off with our lands, we've got a familiar concept. Solastere is bringing in a new set of bounce lands in the Nebula's cycle, each of which enters tapped, bounces a land you control to its owner's hand when it enters, and this time taps to add 2 mana of their respective colors. We did already have a bounce land in rotation with Jubilant Docks, which makes you choose a color and taps for 1 colorless and 1 of that color, but this will help meet restrictive casting costs a little bit better, and give us a heightened density in cases where you may really want bounce lands. Unfortunately, we're still light on any ways to scam the enter triggers here, as anything we have to counter triggered abilities are limited to countering abilities from non-land sources, but they'll at least be worth keeping an eye on in case we get some sort of synergy like that, or a means of having these come into play untapped. If nothing else, these are really great with things that can untap your permanents or your lands to make it so those effects can yield more mana than usual. Perhaps more impactful are the cycle of observatories, each one at rare and with their corresponding basic land type. Each observatory enters tapped if you control a land that's missing their key land type, incentivizing you to play exclusively lands of the relevant type, and comes with an activated ability requiring you to tap it and pay at least 1 mana of the relevant color. Going through them in Wooburg order means we're starting off with perhaps the best of the bunch, Lacufei Observatory. This Plains lets you pay 1 and a white, tap it, and exile a creature card from your graveyard to make a tapped 1/1 spirit token, which isn't a game-breaking activated ability. It's fairly solid once you start running out of gas, provided you're on enough creatures to reasonably anticipate keeping it fueled. The big draw here isn't even necessarily the rules text so much as it is the type line. This is a hit for both Contest Coordinator and relevant for Welkin Eviction, because those are both pretty thoroughly played cards that incentivize you to care about having a lot of planes. And in strategies like the green-white eviction decks that we've seen, this could be a very relevant pickup to help sort of slot out a couple basic lands for these, because they don't really want to lean on non-plains lands to begin with. Zymoth Observatory is on the opposite end of that scale, I think, as an island that taps to surveil 1 for 1 and a blue mana. There aren't any clear homes for this, as mono blue really hasn't had the heyday that our other monocolors have enjoyed in recent memory, but this does make up for that by being reasonable enough selection in a pinch, assisted in any case where your deck is leaning primarily or heavily on blue mana. This brings me to my overall thoughts on the observatories, which is that they are incredible monocolor incentives as strictly better basic lands in that context, but I think they're just not horrible outside of that context, provided you care about the activated ability. They're still ways to, build your deck in such a way that they can come in untapped early on, and they'll always be untapped lands on the first turn of the game, no matter what your other lands in hand might be. Up next is Kara's Observatory, the other one with a clear and potent home courtesy of mono black midrange. This land lets you tap it and pay a single black mana at sorcery speed to exile a card from an opponent's graveyard, requiring you to target, of course, but you do also have your opponent lose 1 life when you're able to do so. It's not awe-inspiring, and it doesn't have to be. This is chip damage in your mana base that also helps fuel your Damn to Hells, which is something I'm sure this deck will dearly appreciate. I think some of the other mono-black tools in Solastere are also worth eyeing up for this strategy, so it's likely we'll see Kara's Observatory around here and there. Carousel Observatory is the red member of the cycle, letting you tap and pay 1 and a red for the chance to discard a card and draw a card. Mono red hasn't exactly had much reason to exist due to the strengths of our mana fixing and multicolor aggro tools, and even when leaning into synergy with this, there's no reason to commit to just red for this land when some of the best permanents and partners in crime for these strategies happen to exist outside of red. But don't get it twisted. I do think this will show up in looter aggro decks, because even beyond monocolored shells, it reliably casts things like Calamity Cat, Ignited Soul, and some of the new tools we're getting from this set on turn 1. It won't be played in as many copies as some of the other observatories will demand, but I do think this will pop up here and there. Gorian Observatory is the final piece of the cycle, tapping to create a chart token for 1 and a green mana. At first glance, I am thoroughly unimpressed with the premise of spending 5 mana to draw a land across the 2 mana for the activated ability, the 2 mana to crack the chart, and the mana you give up by tapping this to make a chart instead of adding mana. However, I think the real strength here lies in not using the charts for their intended purpose. I am, as always, a sucker for trinket token synergies, and there are a fair few cards in the format that are looking for more reasonable trinket token engines. This is a very slow element of that synergy compared to some of its competition, but I think it's also the lowest inclusion cost among a lot of them. I think this is still ultimately going to be the weakest of the observatories, but for any deck that's looking to play mono green, it is still a very free include. And I think tools like Lavis Root Exec, Imperfect Fugisaur, and Realm Violator don't mind the little bit of extra help from the mana base. Solastere has a Defenders Matter sub-theme, similar to those we've seen in past sets like Karslav and Kutalia, but this Defenders package comes with a bunch of creatures in the set that are packaged with relevant enter triggers, and with a land that both fixes for mana and acts as an alternate win condition. Prismatic Lay Spire is a rare land that taps for colorless mana or 1 mana of any color, that you can only spend that mana for creature spells with Defender. You can also pay 3 mana as a sorcery to have it indefinitely become a 0/7 wall with Defender that wins you the game at your upkeep if you have at least 7 uniquely named creatures with Defender. With the land counting as one of those 7 unique creatures, you just need 6 others in play. The downside here is that there aren't any truly great creatures with Defender in rotation prior to Solastere, but there is still one sneaky enabler folks have already caught wind of. If you'd have just any 6 unique creatures in play, Invasion's End can set all of them up to enable Lay Spire as your win condition, provided you're willing to run Lay Spire as a colorless utility land instead of fixing for your defenders. Above board, I think this is a pretty bad win condition in Standard, as the Invasion's End plan requires too many things to be going well for you to turn it into a 2-card kill, and I think some of our better removal right now is still able to check it, so long as it doesn't say non-land permanent. But it's certainly cute, and some colors will struggle to deal with it. I wouldn't be surprised to see folks put it through its paces. There's one non-creature token the set makes a couple times beyond just the obvious case of chart tokens, and that's Lotus Spring tokens, made as a consolation for destroying your opponent's permanents across Budding Mire and 2 rares. Budding Mire specifically taps for colorless and can be sacrificed by tapping and paying 3 mana to destroy a non-basic land an opponent controls before giving each player 2 untapped Lotus Spring tokens. Now, this is pretty bad on the surface. Even if you do refund 2 of that mana, Crumbling Ruin is just more effective at serving that role, doesn't ramp the opponent, doesn't give them the card in their graveyard to try and recur. Crumbling Ruin just shuts down the land without any ability for them to reset it, save them sacrificing the land or returning it to their hands to get it replayed in that fashion. So the only way they can undo Crumbling Ruin is to make them put in some work. Budding Mire at least allows them to put in the work a little easier and ramps them in the process. However, the big draw here is that for the next 4 months, we'll also have access to Looming Psyhawk, which can deny the opponent their Lotus Spring tokens and turn this into a ramping wasteland of sorts. As I mentioned, there are 2 rares that also give the opponent Lotus Springs, and we'll talk about both of those later on. So Psyhawk has some real applications with the Lotus Spring cards. For Budding Mire, I can't quite say I'm entirely convinced by the Psyhawk synergy, as that's still 4 mana total to use and get 2 mana back. But it does at least curve into the activation if you cast Psyhawk on turn 3. Last for our lands is Withered Waygate, a rather unassuming land that enters with a -1/-1 counter and lets you pay 2 to tap it as a sorcery and move its counters onto another creature. I don't think it'll see a ton of play, but if we ever get counter manipulation or proliferation effects, while this is in rotation, it could gain some serious relevance down the line, and if you have any reason to care about colorless mana or just have the room to include some utility lands, this is a pretty solid one to just slip some removal into the mana base. As we move into white, we're going to kick off this and each of our multicolored sections with the adventure creatures I think merit some discussion, sorting them by the mana value of their adventure spell rather than the creature's mana value. That means we lead with Serpens Oblis, a 7-mana 7/7 with protection from mana value 1 or less, whose Path of Singularity sorcery adventure exiles a non-land permanent with mana value 1 or less. Playing this comes with a pretty profound statement that you want to see Huskforger Acolyte suffer for its sins. Realistically, I think this is pretty mediocre, but it affords us an opportunity to make a couple general thoughts of mine clear about where the adventure creatures as a whole land. Ultimately, with all of the adventure creatures being high-cost bodies with rather sluggish abilities once they hit play, I think the primary reasons to consider these cards are for their adventure spells or for niche circumstances where having them be either a creature or a spell can actually matter. We'll touch on the latter later on as individual cards make arguments for specific synergies, but outside of those edge cases, I think the card you quote-unquote draw by casting these adventures is rather low impact in most cases, so you need the adventure itself to make a case for its inclusion in the deck. In this instance, I think no amount of hating Huskforger Acolyte justifies wanting Path of Singularity, because even though it's better at checking Huskforger Acolyte than some of our other white removal, it doesn't do enough beyond that to justify really wanting it. So unless the meta shifts to the most aggressive one-drop heavy field you've ever seen, I think this might be a scarce sideboard appearance and nothing more. A more promising one-mana adventure comes attached to Aureola Crusaris, an 8-mana 4/8 flying griffin spirit that makes 4 tapped and attacking 1/1 spirits with flying whenever it attacks. Honestly, this is one of the better combat threats out of the entirety of the 40 adventure creatures. But the real merit here comes with Path of Deliverance, a 1-mana instant that causes any non-land, non-token permanent that enters without being cast in the turn to be exiled instead of entering. There's some real sideboard potential here when running into Reanimator or other graveyard recursive creature decks, as well as just any creature treat strategies in general, and even play against Flicker decks. But I think inside your own Flicker shells is where I like this most, as the Flicker spells from Errors in the Weft, that's Jump, Soul Space Refit, and Refresh Daemon, can target creatures and subroutines you don't control, allowing you to 1/2 punch them out of existence with Path of Deliverance. I'm not sure that's strong enough to justify running a tech card just for that application. I do think the Errors Flickers are getting some added strength courtesy of a new Black Mythic we'll obviously talk about later, so we'll see Aureola Crusaris again in this review, I'm sure. Next, we have Leonis Excirtus, an 8/8 for 8 that gives your other creatures +1/+1. Its adventure, Path of Solidarity, is a sorcery that makes 2 1/1 vanilla tokens for 2 mana. This is one of 3 Raise the Alarm effects in this set, something we already have an abundance of in Revolution right now. So the primary impetus to want to run this over some of the other options is if you want to cut down on how many colors you're running. Except we have 3 options available outside of this in mono white alone. I could see an argument for running Path of Solidarity over maybe Resolute Reinforcements to get all of your token-generating 2-drops to be non-creature spells on the stack. But let's be real. A deck that wants this critical mass of token generation is not making it up to 8 mana without having to run into some existential issues over the course of a given game. Perhaps the most viable of our white adventure spells is also the first scion of another cycle. Each color's mythic adventure is a 10-mana 10/10 Dragon Spirit, each coming in with some degree of relevant keyword and some other situationally strong effect. In this instance, Eltanon the Silent Star hits the board with an indestructible counter provided you cast it, and it's your only non-land permanent in play. Those are 2 equally rough conditions to meet, meaning this is more often just a French vanilla 10/10, but that's still solidly a lethal attacker if you're just cheating it in. The primary draw here, however, comes with Path of Stillness, an X white sorcery that exiles all non-land permanents with mana value X or less. The closest comparison point we have here is to Ayeshi Breaks the Loop, which costs 1 additional mana and is far more restrictive with its color requirements, and thus has not seen a ton of play. While Eltanon fills a relevant open niche in terms of interactive tools in the current environment. It's also worth keeping in mind that Path of Stillness enables him to enter with his indestructible counter, but I can't imagine that a white deck that wants this will get up to 10 mana reliably. Welcome Eviction, however, is a reason to consider Eltanon, because Welcome Eviction naturally brings up green-white eviction, and brings up our first exception to the adventure creature viability rule. All of these cards are valid hits off of Rejuvenation Session. Being able to run a board wipe in green-white eviction that doesn't mess with your numbers for Rejuvenation Session hits is a pretty big deal, and it's a major part of why I think Eltanon will be the most viable of the white adventure creatures, even if the creature side isn't too impressive. And if you can ever stick Eltanon, that's a 10 mana value permanent with Rejuvenation Session. Worth considering. Alright, enough of these 7+ mana cards, let's get right back down to the start of the curve. Acolyte of the Beyond is a far simpler card than any of the adventure creatures, as a 1/1 Moonfolk Cleric with lifelink for 1 that makes a chart token when it enters. I don't think it'll be a key component of any strategy, really, but it could be worth considering in white-black Hardsuit. A 1/1 that makes an artifact token for 1 mana is decent enough at meeting the requirements of that deck, and it qualifies as a reasonable part of any big Bind Life to Steal pile when rebuilding the board in that strategy, especially since Bind is a good reason to actually crack the chart and find an extra land. The lifelink also just means that it's relevant for Attuned Acolyte, stacking up a bunch of Exalted triggers on a creature. If you really desperately need to pad your life total when fighting for the board, swing with the Acolyte of Beyond rather than any of your other creatures and let that lifelink actually carry work for you. From token on enter to token on death, we've got Oblivion's Escort, a 1/1 human cleric for 1 that makes a grounded spirit when it dies and can be sacrificed for 1 to give another creature you control indestructible for the turn. It's a fairly solid role player for Aristocrat strategies, both as a 1/1 that replaces itself and as a means of protecting your relevant creatures higher up on the curve. Between this and Catch Constable, the start of a white-based Aristocrats curve has begun to form, though it's hard to say what other reasons you might have to actually bother playing with white in those strategies, when both black and red are such core colors, and blue is still the premier splash color for Envoy of the Fallen, and as we'll get into later on, red and green are really the sacrifice colors in this set. Perhaps it'll take further exploration of fodder generators like Diviner of the Sun to help push the white cards into the fray. We've made tokens that are 1-drop entering, tokens on the 1-drop dying. Now let's make tokens as a reward for making tokens. Radiant Pilgrim is our 2/1 for 1 in white, a Moonfolk Cleric that this time makes a 1/1 red spirit with Wither that's tapped and attacking whenever it attacks, though only if you've already previously made a token this turn, and also that sacrifices at the next end step, meaning it functionally just attacks for 3 without any Anthem effect, provided you can keep it online. Token decks being inclined towards Anthem effects, though, definitely does help out for making this more potent. But with the best Anthem in white being Consume the Divine, that can be a bit of an awkward mismatch. That said, there are plenty of other good anthems like Casus Belli and Futurist Ideal, so Pilgrim could still hit for quite a lot in those shells, provided they build with it in mind. I promise there's cards to talk about that don't care about tokens too. Void Prelate is a 2/2 for 1 that enters with a -1/-1 counter and has Wither, and you can tap it and spend that counter as a sorcery to pay X and reanimate a creature with mana value X from your graveyard with its own -1/-1 counter. There's some real appeal here on the surface, but it can't exactly recur itself, at least not without instantly losing the reanimated Void Prelate, because it would have 2 -1/-1 counters. You can weaponize that new creature's -1/-1 counter with any discharge creature from Cyberos that starts with at least 2 toughness, so there's some innate synergy within the format here, and you can also use that counter as an extra draw from a reanimated Dormant Monstrosity. And these are true about just about any of the -1/-1 counter effects in the set that can hurt your own creatures. Beyond all of that, I think Prelate looks solid if you're on some form of sacrifice deck as a cheap threat that can bring back another key creature, or just refire the death trigger on a cheap 1 toughness body in your bin. And Wither is nothing to scoff at in terms of being able to help you hold down the board. Skyray Tender moves us up the curve here as a 1/1 for double white that makes a 2/1 flying fish token when it enters. It's a pretty solid option for token generation and general go wide strategies, and it's a good candidate to curve into Consume the Divine with, as well as a solid creature to pick up with Softlight Harmonist and other reprieve creatures. Considering we can compare this to our 2-mana make a pair of 1/1 spells and realize that this makes one of those 1/1s have an extra power and flying, this looks really good. Evangel of the Long Night is an interesting candidate for tokens that pushes us away from the traditional token payoffs. It's a 2/2 for 2 that makes a chart when it enters, and if you would create tokens while having at least 7 lands, you make 4/4 flying dragon tokens instead. This isn't really an option for Attuned Acolyte or similar payoffs that lean aggressive due to how late this engine would come online. This looks far more interesting as a consideration for grindy token strategies like Ardor and Nimue would imply. That said, in those cases, Evangel definitely suffers the sin of being either impactful or win more without much room in between. So while it's a sweet concept, this doesn't feel poised for constructive relevance unless there's some synergy I'm missing. This could be really cool with Lavis at least, but I don't know. Lacufe Kincaller is a much better tokens payoff, I think, and a solid aggro tool for any low-curve white-based strategy. It's a 3/3 for 2 with Wither that puts a -1/-1 counter on a creature you control when it enters, and you can pay a white and remove the counter from itself to give your other creatures +1/+1 for the turn. Again, tokens is an obvious home to consider for this, but I like it more in activated ability aggro to fill the 2-drop slot alongside Amber and perhaps the recently buffed Venture Capitalist. Aggro definitely fell off as 2025 went on, but I think there are still tools around to help it succeed rather confidently. Helia Eulogist gives us an alternative to Dawnward Minister as a 1/3 for 2 that draws you a card if your life total is above your starting life total, and otherwise gaining you 3 life. The biggest obvious boon here is the higher toughness, meaning Eulogist does a better job of holding down the fort compared to Dawnward Minister. But the drawbacks do start to emerge in the form of less reliability, as you may not always care for the life gain compared to the card draw, and Minister guarantees the draw and asks you to jump through a hoop to just gain the life on top. With that consistency in mind, I think Dawnward Minister will outshine Eulogist while they both share the format, but it is a solid alternative if the format starts to skew a little too aggressive for your liking. Lacufae Lay Tower is our first Defender to consider, a 0/4 for 2 that lets you pay 2 mana as a sorcery to give a creature you control Vigilance until end of turn, allowing that creature to hit with its toughness and attack despite having Defender for that time period. It is a classic effect in terms of Defender Matter synergies, and one I don't suspect will be all that relevant and constructed, but with some of the other Defenders coming up, it felt worthwhile to at least note that we do have this effect coming into the format. Next is a pair of 2-mana instant speed removal spells that generate a chart token, but who gets the chart depends on what's being removed. Fateful Ascent destroys a creature or planeswalker and gives that permanent's controller a chart token, while Renounce the Worldly just picks up an artifact or enchantment and always gives you the chart. Notably, Renounce doesn't require a target if you're particularly desperate for the land. By the time you're spending 2 mana twice to turn a removal spell into a land, I think you have bigger problems. Renounce will be a worthwhile consideration for the sideboard of any strategy that might care about chart tokens, and Fateful Ascent will be a main deck tool I expect to see a lot for the next 2 years. Most comparable to Fateful Absence of canon history, giving the opponent a chart token is far less painful than handing away a clue, since you know the opponent will never be drawing a spell you have to worry about. As a result, Fateful Ascent's biggest weakness is just that it helps ease opponents out of mana screw, and even then it requires them to invest mana to start digging their way out, while you get to pick off some of their key components on the board. And realistically, by the time they have anything you'd want a hard removal spell for, the extra land won't be that high impact anyhow. Renounce is alright, but I'm comfortable saying Ascent is fighting for the title of best targeted interaction in the set, which is pretty high praise in case you already know about the 2 big reprints coming up in later sections. Next up is Helia Leyspire, another death knell for folks trying to feel secure in their Graveyards Matter strategies, also known as me. This 3-mana 1/5 Defender exiles each opponent's graveyard when it enters, and exiles any other cards that would attempt to go to their graveyards while this is in play. Crucible of the Burning Sun has certainly made waves as one of the winners of the graveyard hate free-for-all we've witnessed over the last few rotations, and now this Leyspire gives us another alternative, albeit exclusive to white decks. The body is significant enough for slowing down the pressure from aggro decks, and meaningfully picks off 1-toughness creatures that get a little too reckless when swinging wide enough. But honestly, my favorite part of this card is that it does what Crucible can't, immediately getting rid of everything in the opponent's bin. Combine that with the fact that this is one-sided, and you get the first strong graveyard hate card we've had in a while that you can actually play in your own graveyard hate decks. In your own graveyard matters decks. It also benefits from dodging most of the usual answers to graveyard hate because it's not an artifact, the rare time that difference could land in the favor of the creature card. Oberys Lay Pilgrim is our first planeswalker of the set, yet another mono-colored mythic cycle found in Solastere. He's 1 and double white for a 3 loyalty planeswalker that makes a 0/4 wall with Defender as he enters, not as a trigger when he enters. From there, you can uptick him by 1 to gain 2 life, downtick him by 2 to exile an artifact or enchantment, and his -7 ultimate turns all of your artifacts, creatures, and enchantments into 4/4s that can attack as though they didn't have Defender. Guaranteeing a bit of protection for him with his innate enter clause means no matter what you choose, he'll have some security in getting additional activations. And if you primarily care for his -2, he does a very good impression of Reclamation Sage, both as our only option for that in white right now, as well as just looking solid compared to our other Rec Sage equivalents in Purifier of Dawnbloom Grove and Hungry Blob. The ult is also a real bit of inevitability thanks to that uptick being unassuming enough and helping ensure we have time to get there in the first place. Any deck looking to run Oberys is likely to be running enchantments as their removal spell of choice anyhow, so being able to swing sideways with those enchantments is also a huge boon. It's also a hit off of Contest Coordinator, as is true of every Planeswalker. I think any deck looking to jam Oberys will probably look to do so primarily from the sideboard, but it's a really strong sideboard tool in my opinion. Hell, he's even 3 mana to get back with a Thorn in Trial if you care. Speaking of enchantment-based removal, we've got Orbital Vacuum, which casts for 1 in double white and exiles a non-land permanent an opponent controls until it leaves play. Additionally, once each turn, you can make a 1/1 spirit token when you cast a spell that costs more than the card you've exiled with it. This is a solid reward for playing Vacuum alongside high-cost spells like Welkin Eviction, which may make it the new secondary removal spell of choice in green-white eviction shells. But there's a lot of competition for this slot right now, and our other 3 mana options have definitely waned in favor of Sanctum of Repression, so we'll see if Vacuum's additional value can give it the edge. I think ultimately it won't, because it's a little too awkward to line up overall. If you hit a 1-drop with this, you're spending 3 mana to temporarily remove a 1-drop until they can remove this, and while yes, you could get value, you have to spend 2 or more mana on a spell to get that value. So any 1-mana spells in your own deck still don't actually do anything with the Orbital Vacuum. I think if you're looking to play one of these 3-mana removal spells, all of the others have reasons to play them over Orbital Vacuum, unfortunately. But, I don't know. Maybe you find a way to put this to use. Up next is Creation Mythos, a 2 and double white enchantment that searches your graveyard or your library for an artifact and puts it into your hand, and then discounts your first artifact spell each turn by the number of enchantments you control. We're going to make a general assumption here that you intend to cast this with at least a couple other enchantments in play, with the intent of casting the artifact you find for free immediately. So let's go up the curve and talk about what's best at each slot and how hard it could be to get those for free after playing Mythos on curve. 1-drop artifacts are the easiest to free cast because Mythos alone meets that requirement, and there is plenty of utility to find here, but probably not a whole lot of raw power beyond perhaps the Majority Whip. 2-minute artifacts just ask you to have 1 other enchantment before this one, which is not only fairly easy, but can even be done on an accelerated schedule if that other enchantment is something like Shigane Manor Burns, which could let you go find a Golden Bloom of the Silenced and play it off of Mythos on turn 3. 3-drops are where free casting these starts to get a little tricky, but there also aren't that many stellar 3-mana artifacts you'd hope to find in a shell perhaps trying to maximize Mythos value. I think the best use of this might honestly be, at least for getting a free 3-drop, is heightening consistency if you're trying to make Autonomous Apiarist win the game. Because if you're building a deck around finding all of your basic lands and then an Apiarist, Creation Mythos helps you find that Apiarist once you hit 4 lands. At 4 mana and above, I think the free cast curve is very unreliable, but if you want to live the dream, you could jam it into a deck with Unending Possibility, allowing you to put a bunch of enchantment tokens into play on turn 3 and keep just a land and Mythos in hand if you have both, opening the door to reach as high as maybe Revolutionary's Monument should you be greedy enough. Realistically, though, I think if there are key artifacts you care about, you can try to jam Creation Mythos even if it can't instantly free cast your target, and the upside of Mythos finding sideboard tech and putting it into play is a nice boon to consider when building this card as a toolbox. Lightless Vigil's another strong card to curve off of Shigane Manor Burns in theory, though I don't think I'm convinced. It's 3 and a white for an enchantment that has a once each turn trigger, letting you make 2 1/1 flying bird tokens that can't block when you put 1 or more counters on a permanent. Now, that's any kind of counter on any kind of permanent, so -1/-1 counters are the inset synergy that's intended, but any time loop saga ensures that Vigil is triggering at least once a turn cycle, always on your turn. Furthermore, the treasure from an on-curve Shigane Manor Burns lets you play Vigil a turn early. So the engine should be pretty clear-cut from there, yeah? Well, Vigil doesn't do anything when you're missing a counter-generating effect like a Saga, and 4 mana for that do-nothing, especially when you're almost certain to have to wait a turn for your first trigger, even in the ideal scenario, certainly hurts its overall impact. The death knell here for me is a familiar foe of mine, in that the tokens are not able to block, meaning that you jump through these hoops for creature tokens that just can't help you recover the board that you probably lost in the process of setting this engine up. If you can get it rolling without being under any serious pressure, it could swing a game hard over time, but that makes some pretty big assumptions that the opponent has nothing to either stop you or put you on the back foot. So, I don't know about this one. Nullblade Artisan is our first Syzygy card of the review, as a 2/3 elemental soldier for 3 and a white that tutors up an equipment to your hand when it enters, and can be tapped for 2 and a white to cheat an equipment into play at sorcery speed. The only equipment that's really worth searching up right now outside of Solastere is the Majority Whip, and unfortunately I think there are better ways to find that and get it into play, like Venture Capitalist. It's honestly a shame that Old Dune is leaving the format alongside this, because this would be the perfect candidate for use alongside both the buffed Blades of Bright Futures and Clouded Pasts, as well as other powerful equipment like Harvesting Blade, Cairn Blade of the Ancients, and definitely Elder Soul Blade. There are 2 equipment cards we'll cover down towards the end of the Solastere review, but I don't think either merits enough consideration for Nullblade Artisan, which is a real shame as the card seems like a good consideration for go-wide builds of activated ability aggro. Our last card for white is actually another Syzygy card in Myriad Crusader. This 4 and a white 4/2 elemental soldier has first strike during your turn, and you can pay 3 and a white at sorcery speed to give your creatures +1/+1 until end of turn. Now, if you're tired of hearing me ring the bell that is Radiant Devotee, time to wake up, because it'll come up again. In this instance, I actually dare to say Myriad Crusader looks really strong in a Devotee shell, because it allows you to tap your early creatures to cheat costs on later creatures, much like you want to be doing with all of your angels, and First Strike's a relevant on-the-ground ability for attacking. The Crusader's activated ability probably won't come up as often, but it's nice to use your grounded creatures that have no safe attacks to cheat that cost, especially when it helps your cheated-in angels hit a little harder in the air. I don't think it'll revolutionize the deck, but it's a solid role player that I'm willing to have a go with maybe like 2 copies. We're kicking off blue with the big mythic dragon this time. Asulio, the Watchful Star, is a 10/10 dragon spirit with flying for 10 mana, as you might expect, and while in play, he strips all other non-land permanents of their abilities, which serves to not only shut off any troublesome permanents on the board, but also stop any enter triggers, or as it enters modifiers from other things coming into play. Unfortunate that this doesn't work with the bounce lands, but this does have some innate protection from things like green-white eviction, because their removal is based on enter triggers from permanents. Furthermore, Path of Humility, its 1 and a blue instant adventure spell, serves to temporarily strip all non-land permanents of their abilities and shut down any triggered abilities of non-land permanents that come in after it resolves. This is a pretty stellar interactive tool considering just how many key cards in the format are predicated on enter triggers, making it very similar to something like a Dress Down, just drawing a 10 mana 10/10 rather than a card from your deck. The big appeal for me here is that Asulio is a good adventure creature to rush into play for that static debuff to non-land permanents, meaning that whether you're grabbing it from the downtick of Iviana Dragon Tamer and ramping into it, or cheating it into play with Born from Fire, it'll do quite a lot once it hits the table, especially since flying combined with the static ability means he's functionally unblockable because no creatures could have flying or reach. Couple that with the fact that any deck looking to cheat this into play doesn't have to worry about it rotting in hand should they find themselves wanting the adventure spell in a moment, and it does look like a solid candidate for a number of scammy and ramp-based strategies that have been lacking as of late. The only big unfortunate part is that anything that could passively give it haste, like Iviana, doesn't actually do so because he strips the abilities away from her as well. Draconos Magistus isn't quite as impressive, but it could be another solid anti-control mirror tool. It's another dragon for relevant cards like Iviana and Born from Fire, but this one's a 6/8 for 8 with flying that just can't be countered. Path of Prudence, meanwhile, is 1 blue for an instant that counters target spell. A cancel with slight upside is pretty hard to justify at times, and right now we've got 2 other pretty solid cancels with upside that both struggle to see reliable play, with Unravel Thoughts coming with far more flexibility and capable of becoming a full cryptic command under certain circumstances, while Avert Disaster can discount its future copies into proper counter spells. When you stack those up next to Path of Prudence, it's certainly far less exciting, but the nice part here is that the added benefit requires no real hoops other than just playing a slower strategy you'd be inclined towards, since the reward is just having a guaranteed late-game threat without needing to run that threat in place of interaction. The fair uses of these adventure creatures definitely demand either heavy ramp or heavy control, and I think this one certainly loves the latter strategy, especially since uncounterability means it can potentially slip through the mirror matches favorably as well. Our last adventure spell in blue is only the third of 4, as there are a few in the set I don't feel are worth discussing. Piscis Duosia, though, did come close to missing out on this review, but I've talked about enough 3-mana clone spells in the past that it'd be unfair to leave this one out. Path of Reflection is purely a clone spell, making a copy of a creature you control at sorcery speed for 2 and a blue, and later on this 9-mana 6/6 fish spirit makes a 6/6 fish spirit token when it enters. The primary home for this is the same home we'd expect for any 3-mana clone as of the last season, that being Gubernatorial Fundraiser combo. Goober helped push Reflected Echo to its fullest potential this past season, as any 2 and a blue spell can easily be cast for 3 unique colors of mana to make an untapped treasure off of the Gubernatorial Fundraiser, while also making a treasure from the token copy pledging to the Vishanki Incorporated clique. The nerfs to this strategy will still definitely be felt, as is true of the departure of the Wander mechanic taking away a looping 3-mana spell from the board, but if nothing else, cloning up a bunch of gubernatorial fundraisers to bank a bunch of mana has to have some way of killing the opponent, even if that plan winds up being as simple as cracking 9 treasures for a pair of 6/6s. God, I hope that's not the win condition they have to lean on, though. Cascade Channeler is a big start to our proper blue curve with a 1/1 with prowess for 1 mana that copies itself at your end step if you've cast 3 or more non-creature spells in the turn. I don't know how reliably you'll be able to trigger this, but with Savvy Smith sticking around for 1 more season, there's gotta be a way to turn these 2 cards into a rapidly escalating board state. Zymoth Windreader is a blue 1-drop for a different kind of deck than Cascade Channeler. While the now rotating Uldun supported flash-based synergies through blue and black, Solastere supports it through blue and green instead. And that curve kicks off with Windreader. It's a 1/1 for 1 with flash, and an activated ability for 3 and a blue to tap and make a 1/1 bird with flying that, of course, can't block. There is a catch to this ability, though, in that it costs 3 generic less to activate if you've cast an instant or a spell with flash the turn that you activate it. So what it functionally does is actually just give every instant and flash spell in your hand an optional single blue mana kicker cost to make a non-blocking 1/1 flyer, so long as you haven't paid that kicker cost already in the turn cycle. I don't think this is crazy, but it could be a solid way to help flash decks go wide and start pushing damage more reliably, although they will still miss the Uldun synergies. Yet another type of early blue play comes for blue tempo this time in the form of Komazoa, a 2/2 flying jellyfish for a single blue mana that puts a -1/-1 counter on target creature you control and can burn its own counters for a blue mana to counter a non-creature spell unless its controller pays 1. Traditional blue tempo has not gotten its time in the sun for a while, and recent blue tempo seeded cards like Skytide Piercer that punch through the board have had the problem of hurting your board state in order to get value from them, because you have to sacrifice the Piercer to actually get the counter effect. Komazoa's got the opposite situation going, as using it to defend your board actively makes your board better, with the caveat that if you can't find a clean non-creature spell to try and counter this with, it may be stuck as a 1/1. Of course, you can also use it to functionally sacrifice another creature you control if you want it to be a full 2/2 for 1, or just, hurt one of your other creatures, starting to make it look like a twisted version of Softlight Harmonist. And if I've learned anything from playing Harmonist these past 4 months, it's that you really can't ignore a 1-mana 2/2 flyer. It's not the only 1-mana 2/2 in blue either. Moonscarred Mystic is also a 2/2 that puts a -1/-1 counter on one of your creatures when it enters, though this one does lack evasion. You can pay 2 mana and tap it to burn one of its -1/-1 counters and draw a card, functionally making a 3-mana 2/2 that replaces itself a bit slower. So not too impressive by that measure, and mostly uninteresting because it's just a 1-mana 2/2 with no evasion, provided you can put the -1/-1 counter somewhere else. One of the things worth considering here, though, is that any of these creatures that puts a -1/-1 counter on any of your creatures can also be treated as an enabler for anything that burns those counters. And in that regard, Moonscarred Mystic is a pretty cheap enabler with a decent value ability in a pinch over the course of the game. If -1/-1 counters wind up mattering in one way or another, Mystic could matter there. Much like was true for Serpen's Obelisk in white, Become Naught feels particularly aimed to give blue an early check to Huskforger Acolyte, though in this case it's restricted to only answering Acolyte while you're on the play. This 1-mana instant either counters a spell with mana value 1, or exiles a non-land token. Both really niche effects overall, given the current environment. We have seen 1 mana to counter 1 mana spells do very little in official standard, and while the added flexibility is nice, it's ultimately a less impressive bounce spell when you consider how effective it is at actually checking tokens and beyond. As with our last anti-Huskforger card, if you've really committed to hating this mana dork, you can maybe give this a shot, but I don't know if Become Naught is even remotely worth it, even in that context. Chart the Cosmos is rather unassuming, but it could have some niche application. It's a sorcery speed cantrip that makes a chart token in the process. Our closest parallel in Revolution's history is something like Glyph of Protection from back in Sphereguard. Glyph had the advantage of putting 2 permanents into play for 1 mana, as well as giving you more flexible outlets for your mana and a bit of life gain over card selection, a bit of life gain and card selection over time. But I think this is the case of being willing to acknowledge that chart tokens do actually have some real value as card advantage, given that the tokens give you something to do in place of playing an instant later on, and can help pave the way for higher cost spells in later turns. It's not the most thrilling way to open up a game, but sending turn 1 charting the cosmos and holding up either a 2-mana counterspell or a chart token activation on turn 2 could be a solid curve starter for blue control decks. And this comes with the useful host of both instant and sorcery matters benefits, as well as any trinket token synergies you might be able to think of. Scintillation Scion is reminiscent of a card I'm especially fond of from rotations past, and comes with a particularly solid upgrade. Scion is a 1/4 for 2 that makes a tapped treasure token whenever you draw your second card each turn. Patron of the Sciences did the same at your end step back in Duelists of Varrow if you'd drawn two or more cards or gained 3 or more life in the turn. And while Scion can't play into life gain themes and can't retroactively count your second draw if that happens before it hits play, it can trigger on both yours and your opponent's turn if you've lined up enough card draw to make it hum. We've got Ignited Soul for 2 more seasons, and Scion might be a solid grab for blue-red looters, both with its synergy with Soul and other looting effects, as well as with just how cleanly the 1/4 stat line lines up with Fabricated Anomaly, since exiling 1 card from your graveyard makes this 2/5 the first time it attacks with Anomaly in play. Invoker's Guidebeast is a very fun one to me. It's a 3/2 for 2 with flash that enters with a -1/-1 counter on itself always, and you can remove a -1/-1 counter from it to bounce another creature you control as a sorcery, though the ability can be activated at instant speed if the Guidebeast entered that turn. This is the kind of payoff I'm referring to when I talk about the reasons to look at something like Moonscarred Mystic and company, as a well-statted 2/2 that lets you replay another creature can be solid for a value or combo engine. For instance, if you can find a way to make the casting of a 1-mana creature spell mana neutral or even mana positive, then Guidebeast plus either Komazoa or Mystic would become a looping combo. There's also just fair uses of Guidebeast, such as picking up a Contest Coordinator and replaying it, which can then, of course, grab another Guidebeast off of its enter trigger, seeing as that bounce effect is an activated ability. Seems like it could be very strong. Midari Leyspire is the next of the rare walls, another 1/4 for 2 that comes with Defender, and a 1-mana activated ability that redirects a target of a spell or ability to itself. It's a fairly iconic effect, cost, and toughness for a relatively strong creature from canon history, but 1 proper mana to hold up is a real cost, and not every matchup will contain cards from your opponent that can meaningfully be disrupted by this. It's a sweet little utility tool when the format shifts to make it hum, but it's much more context dependent than the last rare Leyspire for sure. This is a big deal. Cursory Glance, once in Revolution from REV the Quaking City, and having rotated back at the start of 2023, if my memory is correct, is a card I would happily contend is at least in the top 3 best counterspells Revolution has ever had, if not the single best. It's now back as of Solastere's arrival 2 years later, and I have to expect it'll see play again. It is a 1-and-a-blue counterspell for any spell with mana value 3 or less, allowing it to unquestionably shut down a lot of the key cards in the format and really effectively check early game tools. It's a very strong incentive for decks to start looking at pushing their curves higher up to 4 mana and above, and it'll be a major force at knocking down tools like Foreign Encounter and Fabricated Anomaly from reigning supreme. A less exciting target with mana value 3 or less spell than Cursory Glance, Dream Snare is a double blue unsummon that draws you a card if you target a small enough creature. This is great when targeting a token, I think, where it becomes a proper removal spell and cantrips at the same time. And against more aggressive decks, this is just 2 mana, bounce a thing, draw a card in almost every scenario. But I think in those cases, you might still be better off reaching for Advance of Rune and Whisper or Forced Ejection, as Rune is more efficient and presents long-term value, and Ejection's card draw clause is more consistently reliable while being able to hit anything rather than just smaller creatures to cantrip. Cursory Glance isn't our only constructed aimed counterspell in the set either. Forbidden Treasure is a 1-and-a-blue counterspell for any instant or sorcery, proceeding to strip every additional copy of that spell from the opponent's graveyard, hand, and library. Beauclair's Scorn was a popular card that did this for any non-creature spell at 1 more mana, but limiting it to instants and sorceries does limit its versatility to a degree that Scorn never really struggled with. Granted, I could still see an argument for this, perhaps as a sideboard tool for blue tempo decks to take out a full playset of removal spells at just the first sign of one. We'll have to see how this fares. Eulogy of the Beyond is our first repeatable chart generator, and this one's pretty efficient. It's 2 mana for an enchantment that makes a chart whenever you cast a non-creature spell, and can be sacrificed for 6 mana to rebuy up to 2 instant and or sorcery cards from the graveyard. Depending on the deck, this could be a solid way to generate fodder for fueling Cybersoul abilities, feeding artifact sacrifice outlets, or otherwise just generating a critical mass of permanence, especially since extra copies not only amplify the value, but trigger the ones already in play. There's also a bit of an artifacts plus enchantments theme in the set, so it's possible Eulogy could help enable that plan. Also, the name has a typo in it. That'll probably be adjusted before the season begins. Tamiyo Sunseeking is our blue planeswalker, an X-blue-blue planeswalker specifically that starts with X loyalty counters and has 3 +1 abilities that scale based on the number of loyalty counters she has. Her first ability mills a player for 2 cards for each loyalty counter on her. The second shrinks a creature by -2/-0 for each 2 counters she has, allowing you to split up those targets if you please. And the final ability draws a player a card for every 3 loyalty counters on her. I don't know what deck actually wants this. She's a potentially huge top-end bomb for mill decks, but those are lacking in support otherwise. She's a solid play for ramp decks, but it's kind of awkward that you have to choose between hindering the opponent's board or actually getting to get your value. And she's particularly awkward in the face of red burn spells, giving a 4-mana Tamiyo does absolutely nothing when targeted by a bleeding out the turn you play her, even if an uptick is already on the stack. Consider this scenario. You pay X is 2, cast Tamiyo, uptick her to 3 loyalty, any one of her abilities, and then the red player just burns her for 3 damage. Your Tamiyo ability fails to do anything because she has 0 counters on her and is dead. If she can safely stick around, that is a cascading value and win condition of sorts, but I'm not sure any deck wants to spend the time making that happen. I just don't see her doing a whole lot of work. Master of Null bridges us up the curve to 3 as a 3/2 that makes a chart whenever it enters, and a 1/0 orb token whenever a land you control enters. It also gives your orbs +1/+1, meaning that it's a 2/1 generator on landfall, with the caveat that removing it clears all of your tokens as well. Landfall effects are solid with our basic fetches, but this coming down at 3 mana means your Primal Fissures can't immediately trigger this thing twice. It's also profoundly soft to removal to a degree that I can't find myself feeling faithful about. Novair, Omen of the Rift, is a very strong legendary creature, at least on the surface, as a 3/2 flying bird with flash and an attack trigger to either loot through a card or free cast a spell that costs as much or less than the number of cards you've drawn in the turn. This seems like a shoo-in for Is It Looter's shells, but does put some pressure on getting your draw effects in either the first main phase or on the attack step, as combat damage draw like Ignited Soul won't be able to fuel Novair's free cast clause. That said, flying creatures are stellar beneficiaries of Fabricated Anomaly's attack trigger, so it's going to put it in work alongside Anomaly one way or another. Rift Tracing is not a spectacular card, but I do have to give some respect to an instant speed pair of 1/1 flyers and a chart token, I guess, along the way. 2 jellyfish tokens for 3 mana may make you think of Borrow, but this is a one-time only effect, no flickering this. It is 3 permanents for 3 mana, all tokens, but, you know, it's just in the wrong colors for something like Berry Master as well. Maybe this could matter. I don't think it will. It is tradition at this point that a new future sight effect means I have to talk about Eternal Moonlight combo. For the uninitiated, Moonlight lets you put a creature from your graveyard on top of your library whenever you gain life. Prophet of the Veil lets you put it from your library into your graveyard to drain each opponent for 2 life, provided you're looking at your library without searching. Any card that lets you passively look at the top card of your library fulfills Prophet's condition, allowing the combo to begin firing off freely. It's not the most popular combo, as evidenced by its lack of play across the recent Eternal seasons, but with Eternal Exhibitions announced to begin rolling out starting next February, it's very possible that someone will crack this sooner or later. In Standard, I don't think Partisan will ever make the cut, just because not being able to cast the spell innately, kind of being locked into only one spell off of the top of your library at any time is awkward. But Eternal's best future sight effects are either really sluggish or have no real function. This does solve both of those problems. Celestial Insight is very unassuming, and it's essentially just a reskinned reprint from standard set in official Magic, but this could still be a pretty solid role player in control strategies. It's an old classic effect, 4 mana to draw 2 cards at instant speed, but it does also make you a 1/1 spirit in the process, allowing you to use it as a sort of semi-fog to evade an opposing attacker's combat damage for the turn, or even as a small bit of inevitability when backed up by enough removal. Back before Theros' Age of Tracks rotated, this role was served in blue-controlled decks by Travel Through the Mystic Sea. But while that had a more powerful draw effect and the potential to cost reduce itself, I think Insight's token could help do enough to get some overall play. I'm not super optimistic here, but I don't know. It's worth remembering that it exists. Ulfven Skylord. There we go. I can read the name on the card, is our last blue card and a splashy top-end threat that casts for 2 and triple blue. It's a 5/5 that starts off with 2 -1/-1 counters, and you can burn those counters for a blue mana to draw a card. Importantly, it has flying and hexproof as long as you've drawn a card in the turn already, meaning it is almost always hexproof and flying on your turn, and certainly from your first main phase onward. And that draw ability is better saved as a means to counter targeted removal as a result. I'm not sure it outperforms Jetstream Cruiser, but that's only got 4 more months in the format anyways, so maybe the Skylord starts popping up once May rolls around. And say it with me, folks, this is a hit off Contest Coordinator! Black is opening up its Mythic Dragon as the start of its section as well. Rastebal the Enduring Star is a 10/10 for 10 with flying, as you might come to expect. And he comes into play with a ward cost requiring the opponent to pay half of their life total rounded up, as well as a trigger to gain you life whenever an opponent loses life. Its adventure, Path of Oblivion, is a single black mana sorcery that makes target opponent discard a card, and drains them for 2 life if they discard a land card this way. This isn't too far removed from Phynax's Touch in all honesty in terms of base effect, but Touch certainly had the far more valuable long-term use as either a repeatable discard effect if you can just flicker or bounce it, or even just a cantrip from the board if you need that. Path of Oblivion is also technically going to cantrip and for no life nor additional mana spent. But that additional card is stuck at 10 mana, so it's unlikely to be relevant anytime soon. Ultimately, I could see Path of Oblivion getting some use, but it's not the most convincing card. There is also a janky 2-card combo with Rastebal proper in Eternal, but that requires you to get Rastebal in play, activate a Blood Feast Baron, and then gain life or deal damage to the opponent. So I think that might be a little too much mana and a few too many hoops. Nuile Exodus is one of the best adventure creatures in the set by comparison, courtesy of how well it lines up with one of the best edicts Revolution has ever had. Path of Hunger is a 1-in-a-black instant that forces a player to sacrifice a creature or planeswalker, banking Exodus as an 8-mana 8/6 for later on that makes the opponent sacrifice all of their creatures and planeswalkers that are tied for the lowest mana value each time it attacks. Suffer Vile Retribution was definitely a staple edict of Revolution eras past, and while Coalesce allowed it to have value if it was milled or discarded, the sorcery speed restriction has held it back from eternal play, as has the vanilla body. Retribution at least forces the second edict comparative to Exodus, but I'd contend the long-term threat of Exodus combined with the heightened strength of its front-facing edict is enough to justify it as the Formic's edict of choice moving forward, especially since the competition is stuff like Ruiner's Execution and they haven't really been seeing play. Aspis Venefear is the last adventure creature card we'll talk about in black, but it's another solid one. Path of Virulence is a classic tech card, 1 black to give all creatures -2/2 for the turn at sorcery speed. And the creature itself is a 7-mana 7/6 that gives up to 1 creature -2/2 for a turn whenever it attacks. The only alternative we have to this right now is Failed Gateway, which is undoubtedly better if you can corrupt it, but the best mid-rangey black creatures innately have 3 or more toughness, so I think this could just justify itself in place of Gateway in those shells. Karaz Martyrs kicks off our normal black cards. It's a 1/1 for 1 that draws you a card and has you lose 1 life when it dies, and can be sacrificed for 2 mana to get an additional card draw and life loss from the deal. Aristocrats went from 0 to 100 with the Cliques of Nylon buff patch giving us Envoy of the Fallen, and while the December patch did come with some hits to the current build's strength, it's still largely intact, and the functionality of Envoy of the Fallen in that shell is mostly untouched. One of the holes the deck has right now is that its current one-drop suite is pretty exclusively built around Omen Skulker and Newborn Oni, trying to yield treasures and additional sacrificing permanents out of any given sack outlet. The next best one-drop I've seen in the shells is Catch Constable, mostly as a one-drop that replaces itself on board when it dies to get 2 sacrifice triggers off of an Envoy. But Martyr represents an alternative to that slot that I think could cover some ground in that strategy, substituting the additional fodder in play for more cards and helping you find things that you actually care about in any given situation. It won't be a universal one-drop, but I think this will be a major facet of sacrifice-oriented strategies moving forward. Fleshless Flayer is a 2/2 horror warlock for a single mana that can't block, returns itself from your graveyard to your hand whenever a creature enters from or a spell is cast from your graveyard. My gut says this wants to be played with all sorts of return from graveyard creatures first and foremost, but the best ones we could try and have applicable here are Catabolist and Bootstrap Demon, neither of which has put up tremendous results thus far, and neither of which can adequately leverage the Flayer returning to hand specifically rather than the battlefield. It could be pursued as another avenue of being something you don't actually intend to cast in Looter's decks, though the best flashback spell available for any of those strategies is headed out the door with this next rotation. And it also does have it's also a decent pickup for the Kindred strategies from Exalt's Twiltree, because it's a 1 mana 2/2 horror warlock, so it's relevant for both of the key subtypes in blue-black. I meant to move over to this slide when I started talking about looters. Whoops! That being said, I can't fathom a world where Horror Kindred will make any real waves, but I can't deny that Fleshless Flayer into Coven of Brine is an interesting start to a curve. Perhaps the better one-drop to loop with looters is Discordant Voidling, a 1/1 for 1 that can't block creatures with mana value 7 or greater, and which can be returned from the graveyard to your hand for just 2 mana at instant speed. It's not a stellar card by any measure, but considering the hoop to get this back to hand is far more reliably accessible than other recursive discard fodder like the aforementioned Flayer or something like Dawnsworn Survivor, it's hard to deny the idea that Voidling has some tangible potential, even if it doesn't look like much. The biggest problem for Voidling is that looter decks are really tight on how much mana they can afford to spend on any given turn, and 2 mana is a pretty serious ask. Much like how Cursory Glance's return is a game changer for blue decks moving forward, Twilight Ambush will undoubtedly be one of the biggest pickups black gets from this rotation. Originally joining the format in Blood Like Rivers, we've only spent 16 months without it in the format since it rotated at the start of the Cliques of Nyland season back in 2024. But the 1 mana removal spot in black has straggled somewhat in its attempts to fill the void of Twilight Ambush. Downlink Overload is the best alternative we have right now, but its inability to kill the variety of key 2/3 creatures like Exorcist of Errors, Syra Blade of Memory, Faithline Marshal, and especially Fabricated Anomaly represents a fundamental flaw in how well it can help the color check those problems. And the mill you give the opponent has been routinely weaponized against decks leaning on Overload, such as the Black-Red Reanimator Shell or the recent Boom in Aristocrats. Overload I can't say that Twilight Ambush will erase Overload in its totality, but I have a hard time seeing a reason to turn to Overload now that Ambush is back to cleanly deal with those problems. Lament of the Long Night is an interesting idea, but it might not really cut it compared to the graveyard hate available and the problems that need to be checked from graveyards in the first place. It's a 1 mana sorcery that exiles a card from a graveyard, either gaining you 3 life if it was a creature, or otherwise replacing itself at the cost of 1 life from you. It can also be flashed back for 3 mana, giving it some longer-term usability to help it be a repeated cantrip of sorts, or as a way to keep padding your life total. The biggest problem here is the timing, as a sorcery isn't a clean way to check a specific card in a graveyard right now, and even beyond that, there are larger issues. The most comparable thing right now is Corpse Experiment, which lacks the timing issue, but can't pick off non-creature cards from graveyards. It's not too big of a deal right now, as the key things coming out of graveyards are creatures, and yet Experiment sees no play whatsoever, because we have better ways of checking graveyards like Crucible of the Burning Sun or Clash at the Shaded Maw. The one thing I could see giving Lament some staying power is that it overlaps with Discern to give something like the Witchery Shells 8 different copies of a 1 mana cantrip with a 3 mana flashback to try and weave together 4 total mana across instants and sorceries for a turn. But I have yet to be convinced by Witchery, and I don't think Lament is the thing that will do so. Mercenary of Dusk is a pretty sweet aggressive card, and I think it could be a solid pickup for a black-red shell for looters. It's a 3/2 for double black with Menace, and it mills any number of target players for 2 cards when it enters or attacks. As Ignited Soul has proven over the last 16 months, a cheap menacing attacker is really good at chipping in past the opponent's early defenses, and Looters is already a strategy primed to make their evasive creatures more threatening with burn damage and buffs from Fabricated Anomaly helping to spiral matters out of control. I think the thing that helps it nudge over the top is just how much the mill helps your Fabricated Anomalies dial up the pressure. As the biggest weakness for Anomaly after the nerf to the Puzzle Box token is how much it preys upon your cards in graveyard and starts to dwindle its own supply beyond what Looters alone can provide. Even beyond Looters, this is a solid enough stat line with Menace that I think for the cost that I think it'll be a player in most aggressive black decks, provided they can justify the restrictive cost, and especially if they can weaponize the graveyard in some fashion. It's not the only double black card providing a real shakeup to graveyard strategies, too. March of the Long Night is a sorcery that reanimates a creature with mana value 3 or less and makes each opponent lose 3 life for double black. I think I mentioned that. Whoops. This represents a turn 2 3 drop off of any turn 1 looter, provided that looter can be cast for either black mana or off of a black dual land, and certainly favors aggressive strategies given the added damage over the top. If you're wondering, yes, I do think black-red looters would like to play an Unearth that has a lava spike glued to it, and this will be our chance to test my theory. The only downside here right now is simply that the black 3-drops right now are pretty lackluster in terms of aggressive potential, and I don't think Solastere fixes that particular bottleneck. Hollow Prophet is another one in the graveyard recursion pile, though I have no idea what this is meant to be doing by comparison. It's a 2/2 for 2 with Syzygy and an X and a black tapped ability to reanimate a creature with mana value X and give it a finality counter at sorcery speed. The Syzygy ability here doesn't do a ton to accelerate Prophet onto the board, though it could be nice to help it weave into your turn alongside another creature spell with relative ease. The big function here is that you can tap those creatures to fuel the activation, potentially paying a single mana to reanimate a creature into play. Now, why you care about this is all beyond me. It's not really an aristocrat's tool because the finality counters it doles out prevent death triggers from happening again, and that's really the only recursive strategy right now that can stand to build a wide board for the Syzygy discount in the first place. There might be something to do here, especially if you can flicker away or otherwise burn up that finality counter, but especially considering that this now looks a little bit worse with the Envoy of the Fallen's combo potential shut off. Because that cast trigger is now on the Envoy, Hollow Prophet reanimating Envoy no longer does anything meaningful besides get back the sack outlet. I guess you can get this off of Contest Coordinator, tap the Coordinator to cast this for 1, and then use that activated ability to get back more Coordinators? Probably bad. Nightshade Extricator is up next, and while it's a tad awkward as a mostly French vanilla threat, I do think the stat line and effect on offer are at least worth analyzing. It's a 2/4 for 2 that enters with a -1/-1 counter on it, and comes packaged with lifelink and wither to make it an effective and annoying blocker, and also an annoying attacker. You can pay 2 and black at sorcery speed to hand its -1/-1 counter over to another target creature. Unfortunately, while a 2/4 stat line could be practically untouchable to some early removal right now, Twilight Ambush showing up does close that gap a bit to a point where it's not going to stick around for as long as you'd hope. But it's still a great stat line for combat purposes, and the Wither helps us do wonders at slowing down more aggressive opponents from swinging in with their own 2/3s, especially as it heals up any damage you might take from other creatures. I'm not sure I could say where this will find a home, but it certainly could. Oblivion Surveyor's up next, a 2/2 for 2 that makes each player discard a card on enter and makes a chart token for you if you had something to discard at all. It's not that special, but it fills a hole Oldun is leaving behind in Arduous Miners, and while I think the advantages Miners had outweigh those advantages Surveyor brings, such as making the discard optional and being capable of generating a mass amount of permanence with the right setup, it's hard to fully write off Surveyor. Don't expect a miracle, but don't expect nothing either. Nihilemonger is another contender for the aggressive black strategies, as a 4/3 for 2 that makes you discard a card at your upkeep and makes each opponent lose 1 life for each player that discarded a card in the turn at your end step. This is a stellar turn 2 play off of a turn 1 rooftop sling to dial up the pressure fast, but I think realistically this looks best with the usual suspects in looter shells, maybe combined with hand attacking threats like the slink or pressuring ghoul. It could justify its place in the strategy for sure, but the 2-drop slot is getting pretty competitive in black-red looters, so we'll see if it ends up getting into the strategy. Sarsupe Ley Tower is not my favorite of the Defender's package by any measure, but it is decent enough. It's a 3/3 for 2 with Defender that mills a player for 2 cards whenever it or another defender enters play on your board. In multiples, this could really quickly start shredding the opponent's deck, making me think this could be a real candidate for our bevy of clone spells right now, but that is definitely on the janky side of win conditions. And those clones do nothing when you can't find your Sarsupe Ley Tower early enough. The stats for the cost help buy time against aggro at least, but I'm not sold on this plan of attack. Caress of the Stars is probably just worse than Downlink Overload, and definitely worse than our current 2-mana removal in black, but the permanence of this effect is notable at least. It's 2 mana to put 2 -1/-1 counters on a creature and make a chart token. The chart is a nice side benefit here, but I think for 2 mana you are much better off just reaching for Sovereign's Execution. If you can find a reason to care about the -1/-1 counters or the chart token, this does gain a bit of ground, but I think unconditional removal beats small removal almost every time. Mantle of Dusk is a 2-mana edict on an enchantment, which I believe makes it the 4th of its kind in Revolution history. However, it's probably also the weakest of its kind because it's an aura that has to attach to a creature on your board. Though you do at least rebuy the enchanted creature to hand when it dies as a bit of extra value, and it doesn't make you sacrifice anything like some of its competition. However, unlike those edicts, I don't think this will see much play at all, because Path of Hunger is going to just kind of invalidate this as being necessary, but I don't know, maybe if you can find ways to flicker auras, you can keep making them sacrifice creatures? I just bumped my microphone. Sorry about that. Lightless Conquest is certainly one of my most anticipated cards in the set. It's a 2-mana enchantment that makes a 1/1 elemental that can't block whenever it or another enchantment you control enters. But it lets you sacrifice a creature whenever an artifact you control enters to replace one of your creatures with a 3/2 elemental. This seems like a worthy consideration for Aristocrats decks, as it both puts sacrifice fodder into play and lets any sacrifice effects that matter, any creatures that generate artifacts, fire off sacrifices without going down on total bodies on board, and actually allows you to upgrade most of your creatures. Between the Treasure Makers and Smiling Sludge, there are a fair few trinket artifacts being generated by the traditional Aristocrats shells, and considering that duplicate copies of Conquest escalate how many elementals each of the first triggers puts onto the board, the potential for fairer fast kills with Smiling Sludge could be rising. Eyes Gone Dark is our targeted hand attack spell of the set, a 2-mana sorcery that lets you strip a non-land card with mana value 4 or less from a player's hand, and make a chart token in the process. Like a lot of chart generators, this really hinges on the idea that chart tokens are card advantage, and it is undeniable that they do generate an additional card in hand when sacrificed, but even across the 2 installments of mana, I cannot bring myself to be thrilled by 4-mana hand attack whose card advantage comes from drawing a land. I think this will falter hard as long as Exorcist of Errors continues to keep itself seated as one of the best cards in the format. But even once Exorcist rotates out in mid-2027, I don't see those final 2 seasons of Eyes Gone Dark being any better than the 4 it will have to share. Yeah, I think this is a good time to kind of riff off script for a little bit and note my overall thoughts on chart tokens, because I've kind of brought it up a couple times, and I never properly scripted it out to my recollection. Chart tokens, as I mentioned earlier, are kind of structured to be treated similarly to clues. And I think that is reasonable on the surface because, again, they are card advantage. And there are times where you want to crack clues to hit your land drops. But this doesn't give you that flexibility. It is only ever a land drop. And because we have so few meaningful utility lands in the format, so few utility lands that are monumental in any capacity, and because Eyes Gone Dark and similar chart token generators create charts that just get you your next land, not a specific land, I'm ultimately just left staring at chart tokens as more fodder. I think I made the point in the Revolution chat a while ago that I would rather activate a berry token than a chart token, and this definitely caught the set designer by surprise. I know they expressed that they were surprised to see people undervaluing chart tokens, and I do think over the course of scripting the set review, I have come to favor chart tokens a little bit more, but it is just the case of it is so much mana to go get something to give you mana. And in that context, it doesn't do what you would want it to do at the baseline of helping smooth out your curve, because on the turns where it's most important to hit land drops, that's when paying 2 mana to get that land drop is going to be the most cost intensive. It helps you get up to those high-cost adventure creatures, but I don't think decks that want those adventure creatures want to be spending their early turns on chart tokens as opposed to dealing with the opponent's problems. So unfortunately, Eyes Gone Dark and a lot of its contemporaries just look a little underwhelming, and things like Lightless Vigil, I believe. Hold on. Lightless Conquest. Things like Lightless Conquest, meanwhile, just look better because they're using the chart tokens as something other than chart tokens. They're using them as artifact tokens with no text. And the thing I'll keep ringing the bell on is that I think artifact tokens with no text are strong. And when those tokens do happen to have text in some situations, that can be nice. But when their strongest application is evaluating them as though those tokens had no text, I think that might be a sign that the chart tokens are a little underpowered. Unfortunately. They do consistently do the thing that you need them to, though. So don't take this as me saying I think chart tokens are bad. I think they're really good design, actually. I think it's a really strong design. I think it's just going to be a little awkward for the sake of competitive play. To a degree that I think we're going to see a lot fewer chart token creation effects come up in Constructed than we might expect to see from something like Clues. Anyways, off-script ramble over. Let's get back to the review with Darkstar Envoy, who definitely gets the message of what chart tokens are best used for. Whoops, I did not plan out on this being what my rambling side monologue led into. This is a 2/2 human warlock for 3 that makes a 1/1 spirit and a chart token when it enters, and can be tapped while sacrificing 2 artifacts and 2 other creatures to drain the opponent for 2 life, draw you 2 cards, and generate 2 black mana. This is the kind of outlet I would love to have with Lightless Conquest around, and fortunately, they will get to coexist for the full 2 years. But even beyond that, this works wonders with the mass token generation effects we have in the format, like berries, and small creatures such as the ones from Conquest and Borrow. The only downside here is that the activation doesn't work with something like Devoted Lackeys, because the full draw 2 and drain 2 clause never targets, meaning the fact that it generates mana at all restricts this from being a non-mana ability, so lackeys wouldn't be able to copy it. However, that interaction also reveals a hidden strength to Envoy, which is that its activated ability, to my understanding, skips the stack once you activate it. So unless it triggers another ability in the process of sacrificing those permanents, it's possible you could kind of slip this 2 damage to the opponent in through any interaction they might be holding up in an emergency. It's a pretty niche likelihood, but it is something that could matter on rare instances. Femoros Ley Pillar scares me. It's a 1/3 defender for 3 mana that hand attacks for any non-land card when it enters. That, on its own, isn't stronger than Exorcist of Errors by any measure, but bring any flicker spell into the equation, and suddenly this is repeatable hand attack that blocks other creatures on the board. Instant speed flickers make this even worse because you can draw step block the opponent in the process. I have to imagine this will get a clause cutting out this interaction, and I can't remember exactly, but I think it might have been said that this is intended to get changed. But even so, it'll at least be one of the more worthwhile defenders for anyone trying to make that strategy actually work. Dwindling Light is a tricky card for me to parse because in theory I think it ties the room together on the Lightless Conquest plan really well, but it is a little awkward. It's a 3-mana enchantment that makes a chart on enter, and once each turn, you can have each opponent lose life equal to the number of enchantments you control when an artifact enters your board. This is one of the primary use cases I can conceive of for not just Lightless Conquest, but also Eulogy of the Beyond, as it means to reliably trigger Dwindling Light across multiple turns, and even multiple times in a single turn cycle. This is also a big beneficiary of the strength of Borrow in its current incarnation, as Borrow's tokens are also enchantments to help dial up the pressure of a Dwindling Light trigger. I can't confidently say Dwindling Light is worth playing, but it's an appealing enough build around that I'm going to try and make it come together if nothing else. Karaz Leyspire is our last defender in black, and like the other rares, this comes with a very useful utility effect stapled on. It's a 2/4 for 4, and when it enters, if you cast it, you can choose a card name other than a basic land card, and strip every copy of that card from the opponent's graveyard, hand, and library, then replacing each card taken from their hand this way at the end of the result.
This is probably the first iteration of this kind of effect that I can feel comfortable encouraging people to play in the main deck, because it solves a big problem that these sort of spells usually have, because it's actively contributing to the board. It's not a win condition by itself, but by helping you strip away win conditions from the opponent, its ability to help you cross the finish line without getting beaten to death seems pretty strong. I'm still a fan of Trauma Spike for the fact that you never actually refund cards in the opponent's hand, but I'm not sure Spike will ever really be necessary beyond speed of use, when Leyspire is the safer option to lean on. Thank God this has a cast clause, so it's not flickerable, but even with that cast clause being present, Revolution tournaments are open deck list, so you never have to wonder if you're going to hit something the first time you cast this. It'll be a little trickier in league play, but if you know the format well enough, you can probably anticipate what to name. Revolution, and by Revolution I mean me, has suffered for 2 years for the existence of Chronicle of Extinction, a slightly overcosted black board wipe with the flexibility to alternatively be an Edict or Hand Attack, and whose functionality in the long term serves to delete every resource the opponent has and win the game by means of inducing utter hopelessness. I'm so glad this card is leaving the format that I don't think I could ever be worried about a black board wipe again. So anyways, Nightfall is a 4-mana black modal board wipe capable of killing creatures far more so than Chronicle of Extinction in terms of its board wipe mode, and whose alternate use case is a means of killing the opponent. Now hold your horses a moment, because despite all logic dictating that I should despise this card for the crime of existing, I actually really like this card, and I think it's a great step up from Chronicle in terms of how flexible sweepers like this should work. A 4/4 dragon with flying is a strong statement given that it's pretty competitively costed at 4 mana, but compared to the hand attack mode of Chronicle that was often the fallback for not needing to check the opponent's board, the dragon here is a far more reasonably played and planned around situation. Any removal spell that still trades 1-for-1 with Nightfall in that instance means that, you might be going down on mana by playing Nightfall as a 4/4. And the threat on offer here is something that actively clashes with any future copies of Nightfall, because if you have to use those as sweepers, you kill your own token in the process. Additionally, while the nerf to Chronicle sweeper mode has often come up as a way in which it hasn't been worthwhile towards the end of its lifespan due to it missing 3 toughness creatures, I'm going to call bullshit, because that's allowed it to get away with its crimes more safely, since you often want to use Chronicle with things like Exorcist of Errors, which don't die to Chronicle anymore. Nightfall, by comparison, actively meaningfully hinders your own board progression, because you have to really plan around the fact that -4/-4 hits almost every creature you could consider playing in a black shell. It's a stellar board wipe, as Languish often was in its time in original Standard back in the day, and this is Languish with flexibility, so I can see why the argument that this does too much might for the current cost is fair. But I really hope that, if nothing else, this convinces you that this is what Chronicle of Extinction would look like if it stopped being a damn war crime. Yes, I hate Chronicle of Extinction. I will, I think, forever hate that card. I like Nightfall a lot more than people probably expected me to. The cards in Solastere, tailor-made to benefit off Borrow, just keep popping up. Zukar Null Champion is our black planeswalker of the set, starting at 4 loyalty for 4 mana, and coming in with no downticks of any kind. His +2 donates a permanent you control to the opponent, and his 2/0 abilities give you 2 different options for interaction or advantage, each at the cost of generating an enchantment token with long-term downside. The first 0 draws you 2 cards while creating Oblivion, an enchantment that makes you discard a card at your end step. The second 0 deals 2 damage to any target and gains you 2 life while creating Entropy, an enchantment that ticks your life total down by 1 at your end step. The obvious internal functionality here is that Zukar is meant to keep your hand full, your opponent's small creatures removed, your life total high, your opponent's life total ticking down, and hand away those painful tokens with his +2. This works especially well curved out from Borrow, where you can make the jellyfish, draw the cards, and then gain the life, and then just never suffer the consequences of having to let this subroutine actually run or leave play. I really dig this plan, but unfortunately there is a sin that this interaction commits, and it comes from flickering Borrow. What a shocker. Specifically, the ERR flickers don't care about who controls the target, meaning that you can blink the opponent's Borrow and then get it back to your board, shutting down some of their resources while reusing the value of the enter trigger. Refit and Borrow have already proven themselves to be a strong synergy in constructed play, and this now threatens to cause even more issues with Zukar doling out the drawbacks to your opponent without you ever having to suffer for those synergies. I really hope Zukar doesn't suffer for this interaction, as I think the error's flickers are the biggest criminals in this case, and realistically, I think Borrow is an even bigger criminal. I'll level with you all off script again. I have put in a feedback form about Borrow specifically because I think one of the things that has been revealing to me between my run of the Eternal Grand Prix and my time experiencing Borrow in regular constructed play has revealed to me that this really wants a cast clause on that enter trigger, because that's a strong enter trigger even if you don't loop it. And being able to flicker it means that you just turn all of your flickers into more value, more board pressure, and more sustainability. All of your flickers being able to do all of that at the cost of a little bit of pain from the leaves triggers is not that big of a deal, especially if the flickers return the card to play immediately, so you can discard a card, sacrifice a creature, and lose 1 life that you just got off of the new enter trigger. I don't know. I think Borrow has proven that even after its pre-rotation nerf, this card is absolutely insane. And I could see the flickers being hit instead, but I think one of the things that is true of a lot of the history of more type-agnostic flickers in Revolution's history is that they cause problems because designers don't design with those problems in mind. They don't prepare the format adequately, I would think, for the potential to, say, flicker a blessing from Theros Age of Trax, resulting in the things that can flicker those blessings and get the creature side that they were attached to, having the flickers get hurt instead of the blessings that were causing the problems. So it's just ultimately a bit of an awkward misalignment that the flickers often reveal just how problematic blinking non-creature permanents can be. I don't know if that's going to change. Revolution designers have historically proven that they really do like blinking non-creature permanents, and I can't blame them. One of my favorite decks in the format's history let me blink enchantments a bunch. But the enchantments that I was blinking were, at least from all appearances, designed to be blinked. So I think that would just be the ideal. And in that regard, I think Borrow is a little too strong to just let blink. That's my own personal thoughts, though. However the curators decide to approach this is entirely valid. I would just be bummed to see the Flickers or Zukar pay the price for Borrow's crimes in this particular context. If something has to pay the price, though, I would rather the Flickers than Zukar. Zukar seems sweet on his own. And even without donating those downside enchantments, there are ways to sacrifice those enchantment tokens as well that would definitely appreciate having good tokens worth sacrificing. So, little rant about Borrow over. Back to the script again. Two times of off-script rambling in just the black section? Oh boy. It's official, folks! One of the most exciting decks from this month's Eternal Tournament is coming to Standard play! Nether Ponderings is a simple 4-mana enchantment that drains the opponent for 1 life while gaining you 1 life whenever you draw a card. This is famously the strongest line of text on Keening Bell Tower, the 4-mana rare artifact from Blood-like Rivers that ruled control decks during its time in the sun. Now, missing out on the rest of Bell Tower's text is a significant enough downgrade to be certain, but Bell Tower's play in Eternal now hinges primarily around its infinite combo with Life Hacker, where a leveled up Life Hacker draws you a card each time the Bell Tower gains you life, triggering the Bell Tower to then drain the opponent and fire off another Life Hacker draw until either the opponent dies from life loss or you do to decking out. Ponderings captures the most key part of that combo and keeps it relatively preserved, enabling black midrange and control decks to run this A+B backup plan pretty safely. Life Hacker even works well with the new Nightfall, because a leveled up Life Hacker survives the -4/-4 effect at 1 power and 1 toughness. I can't imagine any of this will break the format by any measure, as it's ultimately a lot less enticing than Bell Tower due to the lack of additional text, but I could totally see any mono black deck playing Life Hacker, finding excuses to squeeze in a copy or two of Ponderings, just in case. Manifest Naught's a pretty interesting 4-mana draw to here, draining the opponent for 2 life rather than taxing your life as black draw normally would. Importantly, this discounts itself by 2 mana if a player has discarded a card in the turn, allowing this to potentially hit the stack for just 2 mana. For looter decks or resource shredding aggro strategies, this is a great bit of refresh, and I honestly wouldn't sleep on it even as just a fair 4-mana spell. It's like if you could activate both of Zukar's 0 abilities at the same time and make neither of the downside tokens. Granted, you can only put the 2 damage at the opponent and not at one of their creatures, but that's a small price to pay, I think, for Manifest Not. This card seems really good. Femeros Redeemer is a 2/2 elf warlock for 5 mana that regrows a creature or planeswalker card from your graveyard when it enters if it was cast. By itself, that's very underwhelming, but the secondary once per turn trigger on your turn helps speed up the power of it significantly, because you can cast a copy of a creature or planeswalker spell leaving your graveyard with life instead of mana. I'm not sold on this as its own reanimation tool because of just how much life you have to spend to get something worthwhile out of this in the first place, and for just how awful stranding a reanimation target in your hand can be. That being said, it's possible this starts to edge out Weft Dancer for being less color restrictive and not eradicating the reanimation target from existence. And hey, if we get high-cost planeswalkers worth reanimating, it's possible Redeemer does stuff with those too. Last up in black is Guidelight Graveheart, a 4-mana 3/2 zombie elk that optionally reanimates a creature with mana value 3 or less when it enters, and drains the opponent for 1 life each time one or more cards leaves your graveyard during your turn. The recursive combo player in me is enamored with both halves of this text box, but 5 mana does seem like a lot to get this to be good. But with enough cards in your graveyard, this could represent lethal damage in an instant through the use of Herald of the Radiant Banner, through its activated ability, just picking 2 cards out of your graveyard each time you choose to do so. And this is a case where we could see some aspect of the Karina's Substitute combo rise again. After the Envoy nerf, it does do a similar interaction with Graveheart, firing off additional enter triggers. And it cranks up the amount of damage each leaves the graveyard trigger actually deals to its opponent. However, there's no free form of sacrifice that would be super relevant for something like Guidelight Graveheart, so it's hard to say if the substitute combo could really work as a full combo, but it's a sudden burst of lethal damage with a single copy of Graveheart and just like a couple substitutes in the graveyard and stuff you care about shredding from the graveyard beyond that. It's awkward in the process of pulling this together, and that does far less to hurt the opponent than was true of Envoy or Aristocrat's Shells in their entirety. Words. It's almost like I've been talking for too long. It's the midpoint of the review. I am taking a break real quick to catch my breath, but you won't notice too much of a pause here since I'll just be pausing the recording. So no wait on your end. Before I do, though, it's a good time to remind you that while I'm hydrating, it's good for you to do so as well, and while you're at it, be sure to check out all those links in the description to find your resources to dive into the format yourself. There should also be an info card up here and in the description right about now to Dr. Chipmunk's own review of the set. Highly recommend you give her video a watch, especially with how great she has performed in GPs in recent memory, but maybe stick out the rest of this one first. That stuff will still be in the description and the info card when we get to the end of the video. Alrighty, let's kick off red by getting back to the adventure spells and give the opponent a Lotus Spring token again, so you know what we have to talk about. Manticos Expurgus. Listen, I am fully sight reading all of these spirit names. Is a 9/8 for 7 that deals damage to any target on attack equal to the number of non-basic lands defending player controls. Its adventure, Path of Purity, is a 1-mana sorcery that destroys an artifact or non-basic land and lets the opponent create a Lotus Spring token in its place. Or you, if you're picking up one of your own things. I don't think there are enough good utility lands in the format right now to merit serious play of this, but the ability for Looming Psyhawk to turn this into a 1-mana Stone Rain is very significant, especially in multiples. So it's likely this card winds up on a format watch list, even if its functionality without Psyhawk is far from exciting. Next up is Cancri Escelos, a 7-mana 6/8 that lets you cast an instant or sorcery from your graveyard each time it attacks. You do have to pay mana for those spells, but yeah, flashing back your spells is strong. As usual, the appeal really lies in Path of Divergence, a 2-mana instant that copies the next instant or sorcery spell you cast in the turn. There aren't a ton of spells worth copying right now, but if you can justify spending 7 mana on it, Resigned to Progress is really strong to get copied, even after the nerfs. And just, make your opponent discard, draw 7, discard, draw 7, and you take the next 14 cards of their hand, 14 cards of their library. Yeah, you refresh their hand. You also get twice as many cards to work with as them, and you just got rid of 28 cards from their library. So if you are a slow control deck, that's a real win condition right there. in terms of just escalating them to the end game because their library has like 20 cards left maybe, and another Resign to Progress almost instantly kills them, especially if you can get another Path of Divergence off. I don't know, could be cool. Draconos Tyrannos is another case of a card that feels tailored to shout out an oldie but a goodie. It's an 8 mana 4/8 flying dragon spirit with fire breathing. But the 3 mana sorcery adventure Path of Destruction just deals 4 damage to any target at sorcery speed. It's not 1-to-1 here considering how much worse the body is, but the fact of the matter is that this does a very solid impression of Burning Dawn, a staple of the format back during its time in rotation. The body being worse is a significant hit to be certain, but the presence of battles to heighten the value of direct damage like this, coupled with the dragon typing being relevant for cards like Born from Fire Iviana, and the fact that fire breathing means it's a contest coordinator hit, what a shocker that matters. I could see this getting some real reps as 3 mana 4 damage, because it's just a reasonable rate anywhere where it can go. Because it can go anywhere. It being the damage in that context. Yep, this card actually seems really good, and I'm going to throw my hat into the ring here and say I think this is going to be one of the most played adventure cards of the set, which is funny because it's pretty innocuous compared to some of the others. Surprise, surprise, all 4 of the red adventure creatures merited some discussion, especially through Barin the Fervent Star. It's our legendary 10/10 Dragon Spirit with flying for 10 mana, and he gives you 10 red mana when he enters if he was cast, as well as letting you preserve your unspent mana through steps and phases. Beyond that, his adventure is Path of Radiance, a ritual to turn 3 mana into 4, at the catch of being locked to only 1 more spell for the turn. It's an eminently fair ritual as far as they go, but a ritual that you can play to run out a red 4-drop a turn ahead of schedule, or 2 turns ahead of schedule off of a turn 1 Huskforger Acolyte, will definitely merit some consideration. I think Ardor is likely the best new creature to rush out at the moment, but there may be some new cards or that deserve some attention in this regard as well. Dark Sun Migrant brings us out of the adventure creatures into something pretty messed up. It's a 1/1 for 1 that gets an additional point of power if you have 1 or fewer cards in your hand, and whenever it attacks, you can discard a card to both give it double strike for the turn. Okay. And you also impulse draw a card that you can play for the turn. It will shock nobody to hear that this card feels tailor-made to use any and every Looter's deck in the format, giving red a second 1-drop that can reliably attack and benefit from the internal synergies present within the strategy. It is a stellar beneficiary of Fabricated Anomaly counters. It plays nicely with the idea of valuing your cards in hand as fodder to discard by impulse drawing resources for you. And Double Strike means it kills the opponent really damn fast. It's just an all-around stellar aggro tool. Less remarkable, but I think still solid at a glance, Emblazoned Prophet is a 1/1 for 1 with Menace that deals 1 damage to whatever it's attacking for each spell you've cast in the turn. It's not a card that wants to be in the same deck as Dark Sun Migrant by any measure, as the Migrant's impulse draw clashes with Prophet wanting your spells all to be cast in your first main phase, but the Menace here does help a good amount by letting this get through opposing blockers, at least individually. It's a tad more awkward, but I could see this being played in more generalized mono-red aggro decks, though I think anything pales in comparison next to Migrant right now. Dire Visionary is the least remarkable part of this competition, but it does still do some cool things. Like the others, it's a 1/1 for 1, and this red elf shaman can be tapped by paying a red mana to Rummage. Additionally, whenever a player, you or your opponent, discards a card during your turn, you can pay 1 mana to make a flying 1/1 bird token that can't block. The obvious avenue here is Looters, as per usual, but it is just so much more sluggish than something like Dark Sun Migrant. Now, what I think this really shines is with forced discard effects for the opponent. This ability becomes an even more awkward exchange when coupled with a pressuring ghoul, as any cards the opponent discards to deny the ghoul counter may still result in you adding 1 power to the board. Granted, it's not going to have haste, but it'll still be in the air much like the ghoul. This also has nice internal synergy with Gyama, Scion of Kage, as discarding a card to either of her first 2 abilities gives you a clean window to get a Visionary trigger. The tokens for the Visionary can also pay for the sacrifice costs on Gyama as needed, and Gyama's -2 making the opponent discard a card means you could potentially pay for 2 Dire Visionary triggers from 1 activation. It won't shine anywhere nearly as bright as Dark Sun Migrant, and I think Emblazoned Prophet will also outperform it. But 1-mana value engine permanents have had a history of being good in Revolution, and I would dare say this could qualify as similarly value-oriented for 1 mana. Granted, all those abilities costing mana does hinder it compared to its contemporaries in that regard. Stellar Flare is the big new burn spell for Solastere, and it may finally give us the answer we're looking for to mid-range strategies. Hypothetically, it's X and a red for a sorcery that deals 5 damage to a creature or planeswalker, provided the target's mana value is less than or equal to the amount of mana you spent to cast the flare. The advantage here is plain as day, in theory. It's a 1-mana removal spell for Huskforger that can also answer other threats in the format like Exorcist of Errors. No longer stranding red with the choice between checking the Huskforger with a shock or checking 3 toughness creatures and letting a turn 1 Huskforger slip through the cracks. This never goes mana positive, of course, since you're always trading 1 for 1 or 2 for 2 and so on, but it does check Huskforger reliably and have play in the long term. The only problem with this theory is that if you can't check the turn 1 Huskforger, then the advantage gained by that Huskforger allows the opponent to outpace this anyways, because when they cast a 3-drop on turn 2, you won't be able to Stellar Flare it for 2 mana in return. It's almost the right idea, but I think it falters just a bit too much in terms of its overall strength, and since you can't exactly cost reduce it to get around that issue, I think this will be fine when you're on the play, but a card that you have to sideboard in only after losing a game against a Huskforger deck, just nah. Endlight Crusade is a funky one. It's an X and a red enchantment that makes X 1/1 red elementals when it enters. And whenever you cast a spell, you can choose to exile that spell and Endlight Crusade to replace that spell's effect with the creation of an additional number of elementals equal to that spell's mana value. The base effect here isn't crazy. I think at 3 or more tokens it starts to look good, but having to spend 4 mana to get this into play is not exciting. But if you can reduce that cost with something like a defeated Clash at Mistrit Vale, the number of bodies on the cost, bodies for the cost, gets a lot better in far shorter order. The secondary clause seems best with spells that cost reduce themselves in turn, but the only one I can think of that might be worth it is maybe Hushed Briefing. And though 1 mana to make 5 1/1s at instant speed is definitely good, I don't know if that's better than just scrying 2 and then drawing 2 for 1 mana. Maybe. Maybe Clash at Mistrit Vale can get there. I wasn't too impressed with it as much as I was hoping to be. But we'll see. This could do some things. Instill Absolution seems like it probably won't go crazy, by my understanding, but there is potential for it to push a ton of damage. It's a small buff aura, 1 mana to give a creature +1/+1 while it's enchanted, but the big appeal is that when that creature dies, it gets to deal damage equal to its power to any target. You can find something like Fall Upon Your Blade or Pyrrhic Blast alongside a creature you think could be worth flinging at the opponent, then Instill Absolution not only increases the damage of that fling by 1, but also ensures that you're picking off 2 things instead of 1, or shooting the opponent twice, more importantly, I think. Even in fairer cases, this allows your creatures on board to trade for 2 opposing creatures, though I suppose in that context you're still trading 2 cards for 2 cards. If a fling deck comes alive, this could be great, but I don't know if I'm holding my breath. Rozon Firebrand looks like another solid aggressive red creature to get in this set, but I don't know if I'm crazy about it, because there is a fatal flaw hiding in this design. It's a 2-mana 3/3 with Wither and Haste, and it gets a -1/-1 counter at each of your end steps. Once it dies, which it intends to make an inevitability, it makes an XX Spirit token with stats equal to the number of counters on the Firebrand. Seems like a solid aggressive creature at face value, and definitely a worthy bit of competition for Cash Thrasher, except Firebrand struggles to attack in long term, as its toughness should always be treated as 1 less than it looks. What I mean by that is that it gives itself the -1/-1 counter at the start of your end step, before cleanup would remove all damage it's taken. Meaning, if you can just shock this or block with a 2-power creature, it'll die at the end of the turn and only leave a 1/1 behind. Granted, that's still fine. This could still be a solid aggressive creature, because even if it stops being able to safely attack, you do inevitably turn it into a 3/3 that stops shrinking itself. But I do think this is weaker than it looks. And obviously, if this gets removed immediately, you make a 0/0, which dies instantly. I guess if you care about aristocrats, this does replace itself on death, even with no counters. Now this, however, is a 3-power 2-drop with -1/-1 counters I can get behind. Hypothetically. I don't think it's actually that good, but I like it. Towering Moonrazer is a 3/4 with Wither that puts 3 -1/-1 counters on target creature you control when it enters, and you can tap it and pay a red to remove a -1/-1 counter from it and shoot a player or planeswalker for damage equal to its power. Doesn't look all that great in fair contexts, but if you can find a 1-mana creature worth effectively sacrificing with this, you can get to develop an above-rate body with an annoying combat-relevant keyword to make blocking more of a headache. The problem really does just lie in finding 1-drops worth killing with it. Since the usual treasure-making suspects don't fully work, Newborn Oni at least needs to have 2 power to make a treasure. Things like the new Karaz Martyr could be worthwhile, and maybe you could get sneaky and use something like Sullivan Regrafter to give one of those -1/-1 counters to an opposing creature, but I think this is mostly just here because it's cute. Black Dawn Sellsword could have some potential in aggressive shells for similar merit to Dark Sun Migrant, as a cheap creature with double strike, but this one won't cast for 2 red mana instead of 1. It does also come with haste, allowing it to swing in immediately, and it also does come in as with a means of buffing its power, but you have to spend 2 mana to give it +1 power for the turn. That being said, it shares the same strengths as Migrant for its ability to wear buffs very effectively and be a stellar threat alongside Fabricated Anomaly. It just wears +1/+1 counters well in general. Cheap creatures like Sullivan Regrafter and pump spells like Face of Animosity, allowing you to convert 1 mana into a lot of added pressure through the Sellsword. It's less universally applicable due to the heightened dependence on additional cards to make it sing, but this thing could kill really quickly if left unchecked. Carousel Leytower is our first red defender, and I'll level with you, I think the red defenders are the strongest of the bunch. This is the weakest of the 3 as well. This one's a 2-mana 1/3 with Reach that taps to deal 1 damage to each opponent and untaps whenever another creature with Defender you control enters. It's a pretty clean way to translate Defender creatures into points of damage to the opponent, and is another case of clones working pretty well with Defenders, for the sake of getting them scarier in multiples. Honestly, this seems like a far more stable win condition than the land, provided you can you can back it up with enough control tools and maybe some more pressure over the top. Unfortunately, as you'll see later on in this section, the other red defenders are great at holding the board and applying pressure to the face. Essence Ignition is the closest I'd come to having confidence in an aura for pure mono-red aggression. It is double red mana for a creature aura that gives the creature +2/+1 in menace, and draws you a card when it's put into a graveyard from the battlefield. The replacement clause is what sells me on this, because it means you're safe to use this for added pressure without exposing yourself to a potential 2-for-1. It's honest, but it might be the right kind of honesty to help aggro kill the opponent, and with multiple double-striking early aggressive creatures in red from this set, this could hit pretty damn hard. Inner Inferno is another value engine meant to play well with putting counters on permanents. For 1 and a red, this enchantment impulse draws a card once each turn when you put a counter on something, allowing you to play that card up until Inner Inferno triggers again. You can also pay 2 mana at sorcery speed in a pinch to put a -1/-1 counter on a creature you control, primarily to enable the impulse draw, but also potentially -1/-1 counter spending abilities on your board. I think this is a fair bit more stable than the Time Loop enchantments, than Lightless Vigil. But honestly, I think this is just better with -1/-1 counter synergies, because you can have more control on how long Inner Inferno keeps a card available to you, and you can fuel those synergies. It's definitely not our best red draw engine in the format right now, but it could be solid. Chronicle Calamity and Cosmic Bounty are a pair of different red spells that let you trade them and a card in your hand to draw 2 more. Pretty classic effect by all measures. Calamity is a 2-mana enchantment that does so when it enters, and lets you spend 2 and a red and exile 2 cards from your graveyard freely from there to convert that into 2 damage to target player or planeswalker. Naturally, that's an activated ability, so talk about Contest Coordinator as needed. Bounty is a 3-mana instant that does the same rummaging, while also creating a treasure token. I think we have so many good creatures capable of rummaging that's hard to make anything outside of a creature do work in the format right now, but both of these do have some merits. Calamity is a really good mana outlet while helping you filter out less relevant cards, and again, Conscious Coordinator synergies abound. Bounty, meanwhile, strikes me as a Storm-like tool to dig deeper through your deck while generating a treasure to keep affording you spells on your combo turn. I don't think either will move mountains, but either could be alright. I feel like I can almost see what to do with Helia Extinguisher, but there's some fog in the way right now for me. It's a 3/1 for 3 with haste and syzygy, meaning you can cast it on turn 2 and swing it in for 3 immediately off of a turn 1 creature. From there, that syzygy ability can be used to discount its 5-mana sorcery speed activated ability down to as little as 1 mana, making hasty and trampling 3/1 elementals that sacrifice at the next end step. The possibility of this rapidly discounting ability is exciting, and if we ever find an infinite mana combo in the format, this is a decent enough outlet for that mana. But at the same time, this feels a bit too fragile to hang your hopes on, and 5 mana for that activated ability means it's really difficult to do so fairly for converting your creatures into syzygy discounts without the end result being less overall power able to attack. It's probably not going to work out, but I do think there's something here that I'm just not seeing. Fission Feaster, by comparison, seems plain as day with what this is meant to be doing. It's another 3-power 3-drop with haste and syzygy, this time coming in with 2 toughness and with its 5 mana activated ability, requiring having a second colored mana symbol and requiring you to tap it to use the ability. The reward for rushing out Feaster's ability is to get to add 5 red mana, meaning that for each creature you tap to use the Feaster's ability, you're generating red mana you didn't have access to beforehand. The end result here is that if you have 5 creatures in play, you can cast Fission Feaster for 1 mana, activate it for 2, and convert it into a 5 mana ritual for 3. Then use 3 of those creatures to turn 2 mana into 5 on subsequent turns. The problem here is that this is a ton of effort to make this card work, since you do need those 5 creatures around for Feaster to yield a 2 mana output the turn you play it. By comparison, Thubaran generating 2 mana off of its adventure just requires a cost reducer of some sort or a Savvy Smith. The upside is that Feaster's mana doesn't come with a drawback of you needing to spend it all on one final spell for the turn, but it's also just a far clunkier tool to have to find use for in the first place. It's pretty apparent what it wants to do, I just think what it wants to do is pretty bad. Frenetic Astronomer is weird. It's a 2/2 for 3 that adds 2 red and makes a chart when it enters, allowing you to immediately sacrifice the chart token or use that mana for some additional spell. Now, I don't think this will soar to the same heights, but Transgressive Trendsetter was pretty monumental upon its introduction to the format, courtesy of it entering and making 2 mana. And that had a hoop that you had to meet in order to do so. Astronomer just does the thing, no questions asked, and gives you a convenient way to use that mana so it doesn't go to waste. I don't imagine this will revive any combos, as the other components of Trendsetter combo were Rib Collector, which rotates out anyways, and Serve Again, which just had its infinite loop potential cut off in this month's Eternal format. Which might be my fault, sorry about that. Maybe there's something to do with this, though either cost reducers, enter triggers, amplifiers, ways to flicker this repeatedly. I don't know. Bulk bioengineering could maybe appreciate it if you could, cost reduce this and make this 1 mana add 2 and get a chart. You could stand in unison, double its enter trigger, pick it up, make it 3 mana, get 4, make 2 charts, and then pick it up at your end step. You could flicker it with Imperious Admin if you have 5 enchantments. I think none of these are great. But there's got to be something to do with Frenetic Astronomer. Rosione Laypillar is a very simple member of the Defender's Cycle, and I think it could be pretty good. For 3 mana, this 0/3 just deals 3 damage to any target when it enters. End of story, nothing more to say, just bolt something and be done with it. As is true for some of the other times I've brought it up, this seems like a great argument for why clone effects could look at for Defender shells because of just how reliably they let you fire off your strongest enter triggers from those defenders again and again. But even beyond that, any form of bounce or flicker effect represents the ability to just keep bolting something at will. The format's got a history of 3 mana spells that deal 3 damage, but whereas most of those demand a cost reduction clause to see play, I think 3 mana is just right for here. I think Laypillar's great. Like, a lot better than you would expect it to be for 3 mana deal 3, especially because I was hyping up 3 mana deal 4 earlier. Solastere is now the 4th season in a row we were getting a new 3 mana Pyroclasm effect, and Star Squall will be the 5th total in this next rotation. But it does have some advantages against its competition. For its merits, Star Squall does the familiar 2 and a red, deal 2 to each creature at instant speed, and it makes a chart token on the way out. As far as that competition goes, each set as of late has pushed the previous contenders out of consideration. Calamitous Warcry has felt pretty lackluster since it demands you to care about your creatures in order for it to not hurt your creatures, and have enough diversity among your creatures to actually do so. Boiling Earth has similar problems while also being a sorcery that asks you to care about weathers. But both Advance of Fire and Faith and Saboteur's Immolation have been pretty solid. Immolation trades off the chart token for cycling instead, meaning that you have to get the value through deciding you don't need the board wipe rather than getting value for deciding you do. But I think the big contention here is going to be Advance, where you trade off being able to do so at instant speed for only ever hitting the opponent's board, and having the ability to grant haste as needed if you can just deal 3 damage to it. I do think Saboteur Simulation and Advanced Fire Faith will both be some competition for Star Squall, but I could see this outperforming Immolation, even if Advance will outperform it. As Immolation does have some synergies, like cycling for Born from Fire, or, hitting it off of Contest Coordinator, but I think Star Squall is the more reliable version of this effect of the two. Advance will be the strongest, though, at least in my opinion. I think Darkstar Severance is absolutely a 4-mana permanent worth rushing out, and a reason for you to care about Trinket token generation right now. It's a 2 red enchantment that makes a chart token when it enters, and in the beginning of combat on your turn, it forces you to sacrifice a non-land permanent and create a 3/1 elemental with trample and haste. This has pretty apparent snowball potential, provided nothing on the opponent's board can wall your 3/1s, but even then, you aren't forced to attack, and the 3/1s don't go away. So in the worst case scenario, you can keep Severance from hurting your board state by just recycling the elemental token, and maybe get a sacrifice trigger off of something like Smiling Sludge in the process. I think we're due to see some fairer sacrifice-heavy decks emerge as folks brace for the combo-oriented plans, and Darkstar Severance is an eminently fair but likely deadly way to pay that plan off. Divine Repurposing is for the funky brewers out there. It's a polymorph, casting for 3 and a red and exiling a creature to turn it into the next creature in that controller's library. You can even flash it back for 6 mana. There's just one little wrinkle. It also ends the turn as part of its effect. That means no enter trigger from the new creature, no leaves the battlefield triggers from whatever you exiled, no combat with whatever hasty threat you try to spin into, nothing. Realistically, this is a payoff meant to reward you for jamming the adventure creatures into your tokens decks, because none of the adventure creatures do anything the turn they hit the board, so ending the turn doesn't really matter. That being said, that end of turn clause is also ripe for criminal activity, since if you can give this spell flash, you could use it to remove an opposing creature or polymorph one of your own, while also ending the turn on your opponent's upkeep. Polymorph responsibly, folks. Millicent Spire is the final defender in red, and it's a doozy. It's a 5-mana 3/5 that deals 5 damage to each creature that doesn't have defender and each planeswalker, allowing it to secure the board without giving up your defender's matters creatures in the process. The only tragedy here is that hitting planeswalkers means you can't safely use it alongside something like the Dutiful Wanderer or Amaret, Seeker of the Sun, to blink it, because it would kill your planeswalkers pretty quickly if you do blink it. Fortunately, there's an underrepresented blink engine that already exists in Auspicious Return, which can both rebuy this or another key value creature, and then start blinking it turn after turn to lock down the board from there. Even without synergy, this is a nasty board wipe that stalls aggression after the fact. Solid stuff for sure. We cap red off at long last with its planeswalker for the set. Capella Endlight Catalyst is 5 mana for 4 loyalty with Wither, and she grants Wither to your instants and sorceries as well. You can +2 her to deal 2 damage to any target, which naturally is -1/-1 counters when targeting a creature. Her 0 ability creates 2 1/1s with Wither, and her -X exiles an instant or sorcery card in your graveyard and lets you cast a copy for free, provided X is the spell's mana value. These are 3 really accessible, really strong loyalty abilities attached to a very reasonable passive ability. Nearly every effect here allows Cathella to both protect herself or protect you, and she is her own win condition in a way of that +2 just shocking the opponent down in a pinch, or that 0 making enough bodies to go wide with. Couple that with the fact that the damage she deals to creatures doesn't go away, and she can help make sure your burn spells do the same, and suddenly she's locking down the board in no time. This is a shoe-in for any slower red deck, though in Big Boros there is some tight competition for the 5-mana Planeswalker slot, and Planeswalkers look a little more awkward in something like Big Boros because Millicent Spire crunches into their loyalty. That all being said, I can't imagine a world where this doesn't put work in, so I am keen to see where Cathella takes us. Green at last. We'll kick off here with Rex Tyrannos, a 7-mana 7/5 with Trample that lets you cheat a creature card from your hand into play tapped and attacking whenever it attacks. I'll be honest, that's one of the best stat line and text box combinations we've seen on an adventure creature so far, and for a far more reasonable casting cost than most of them could brag about. Path of Primacy is also strong to boot, a 1 and a green instant that lets you look at the top 5 cards of your library and pick a creature card there to put into your hand. One other card I've mostly neglected to highlight with adventure creatures to this point is bulk bioengineering, because the adventure creatures solve a problem that bioengineering has as far as its fair applications go. It's a critically valuable card to get rolling early, but you can only ever have 4 copies in the deck, so non-creature spells seem pretty necessary to smooth out games where you don't draw it and help you find your bulk bioengineering. But once bioengineering's in play, those non-creature spells become dead cards in your hand. Now with Solastere, you get to run instants and sorceries in your bulk bio deck to pick off early opposing creatures or help smooth your draws. And rather than becoming dead cards when you play a bulk bioengineering, you get to cast those creatures for solid discounts. I think Rex Tyrannos gets added points for how well Path of Primacy works when you're on additional adventure creatures, since that means you could use this to find another adventure spell. And overall, I think if you're going to be cheating in adventure creatures at all, this is going to be a mainstay part of that plan. Okay, so obviously, Huskforger Acolyte is the best 2-mana dork or the best 1-mana dork in the format, because it's the only one. But the 2-drop slot does have some competition in cases where you still dare to play your dorks a turn beyond the Huskforger decks. Enter Alwanor the Humbled Star, our final member of the Mythic Dragon cycle, whose 10/10 body for 10 mana actually lacks the flying that her siblings come with, and instead gets Trample, Reach, and a passive that sets the stats of all of your other creatures to base power and toughness 5/5. Path of Providence, then, is a 2-mana sorcery that makes a 1/1 elf that taps for green mana. That's it. It's significantly worse as a mana dork than Mana Harvesters or Sunsoaker, but those don't draw you a late-game threat. I think ultimately Alwanor is one of the standout tests for how much you care about your adventure spells, quote-unquote, drawing you a creature. For me, I think Alwanor fails that test, but maybe she passes it for you. Ursus Majora is our final green adventure creature in this review, a 7/7 for 7 that gets +2/+2 in trample for the turn as a landfall trigger. Its adventure is Path of Prosperity, a slightly overcosted rampant growth at 3 mana. Once again, the question of how worthwhile a below-rate spell is when it draws you a high-cost creature for later, but I do think Ursus Majora justifies itself a bit better by reliably and stably ramping you to it. As the kind of messed up way of me loading in bulk bioengineering here might indicate, I don't think it's a card to play in bulk bioengineering decks because you want your adventure spells to be relevant outside of bulk bioengineering, and I think 3 mana put 1 land into play is not what I would describe as relevant for those strategies. But if you're just building fairer ramp shells, I think this could be good. Endir Wild Soul is a real game changer for green aggressive decks. It's a 1/1 for 1 that gets a +1/+1 buff as long as a land you control entered in the turn, which is a decent enough case for an early threat, but by no means remarkable on its own considering we have stuff like Plucky Trainer that hits twice as hard off of a fetch land over in red. The big part of Wild Soul is that attack trigger, allowing you to pay a green mana to put a land from your hand or graveyard into play tapped, giving that land a finality counter if it came in from your graveyard. This is undoubtedly better recursion than what we had with Reaper of Blossoms, especially since Reaper was demoted to being an attack trigger itself. And it's good enough that I could see ramp or mid-range strategies adopt Wild Soul as a way to get more reliably ahead compared to Huskforger Acolyte. Lost Pilgrim is also a 1/1 for 1 with graveyard value, but that value doesn't have to come through combat. It gives you the option to mill yourself for 2 when it enters, and while it's in your graveyard, you can pay 2 mana to exile it at sorcery speed and return another permanent from your graveyard to your hand. Seems like a solid little value tool for any graveyard matters strategy in these colors, such as a black-green shell trying to make Jack Monster Mentor hum, but I do think it falls victim to how good graveyard hate is getting as of late. Sunsoaker changes things up a bit for our 1-drops in green. This time it's a 2/2 that shrinks itself. It enters with a -1/-1 counter and gains you life whenever another creature you control enters. From there, you can spend 3 and a green mana and remove a -1/-1 counter from it at sorcery speed to make an XX spirit token, where X is how much life you have over your starting life total. I get the theory here on how it could be useful, but I think this seems as just too much effort required to make your 1-mana 1/1 any good. It does some cool things alongside Laystone of Being, and both of those cards are findable off of Contest Coordinator, but I just don't think that'll matter. Eternal Struggle is a familiar effect we've gotten a number of times, the old 1-mana protection spell. This time around, it's a modal instant that will either give a creature +1/+1 in hexproof for the turn, or exile a card from a graveyard to draw you a card. This seems most immediately comparable to Flutter, considering your modes are protect a creature or get some graveyard hate for the opponent. But while Flutter gets rid of a whole graveyard and just shuffles it away, Eternal Struggle replaces itself while hitting a single card, making it far more useful in situations where you might not need it. I do think its competition in green is a little awkward, as Hostile Evolution stands to get more life thanks to how well it works with -1/-1 counters. But I'm inclined to say Eternal Struggle is a safe enough protection spell you could maybe even get away with it in the main deck, because the floor here is to exile a fetch land or a removal spell from the opponent's graveyard and replace this when you have a mana to spare, or even pick off something in your own graveyard if theirs is empty. Alwanor's Mark is another modal 1-mana spell that's probably going to be more found in sideboards. It's a sorcery that either has target creature you control fight a creature you don't control, or it just deals 4 damage to the creature itself if that creature has flying. The fight mode on this looks a tad lackluster when put next to Momentous Strike, and I think if it's the only reason you care for this, you reach for Momentous Strike every time. No, the real game changer here is that Alwanor's Mark is their first reasonable anti-flying spell in a while. The only thing we have to pick off flying creatures in green right now is Sky Snipe, which does come out at instant speed but costs 2 mana instead, and there are enough cases where the flying creature causing problems has 4 toughness that Alwanor's Mark should be able to clean up those issues instead. It's definitely a meta call if you do put it in your sideboard, but we've had flying creatures rule the board enough before that I wouldn't be surprised if people wind up tapping into Alwanor's Mark here and there. If you thought Alwanor's Mana Dork adventure competition was tough before, now we get to see why it's got stiff competition within its own set. Kinox Naturalist is a 2/2 for 2, arguably the best statted Mana Dork we have in the field right now. On top of tapping for green mana, it also allows you to sacrifice an artifact or another creature to add twice as much green, 2 mana for a 2/2 Mana Dork. The trinket token applications are apparent, and I do think this will be becoming a welcome addition to things like the Berry's Shell. But let's not kid ourselves. This is Phyrexian Tower on a creature, and that's absolutely worth keeping an eye on. I can't quite say where I think Kinox Naturalist will shine best, but that second mana ability is going to do some wonderful things. That much I am certain of. Ursus Minora is the kind of card Stompy decks have been waiting for. It's a double green 3/2 that gets +1/+1 in trample whenever a land you control enters, meaning it can reliably swing in for 4 or even 5 with the right setup. This card, combined with Andir Wild Soul, sets up for a very strong early curve from aggressive green decks built upon ensuring frequent land drops. And I think this will help to define what Green Stompy is looking to do moving forward. I mentioned that green also supports the Flash archetype, and Vista Painter certainly seems like it's trying to do that, but this card is a huge step down. It's a 3/3 for Flash for 2 mana, a 3/3 with Flash for 2 mana, but it enters with 2 -1/-1 counters, and it only clears a counter at your end step if you cast no spells for the turn, though it does make a chart token as a reward for that all happening. So consider the scenario where you flash this out in your opponent's turn while you have 2 lands in play. You untap on turn 3 with a 1/1, play a land, pass, it's now a 2/2. You can cast flash spells during the opponent's turn, do what you need to, maybe crack the chart if you feel like it. Then on turn 4, you play a land, maybe swing in with a 2/2. Move to your end step. It becomes a 3/3. Now finally, your 2 mana 3/3 has reached the stats you were paying for, so you can finally start swinging in on turn 5 for a 3/3 attacker. Maybe if you can weave it in with other plays, then it could do some work, but the fact of the matter here is that the chart tokens are nowhere near enough value to justify running this card when it becomes the single worst top deck later in the game, especially awkward considering it's a card that inherently asks you to take longer to play the game so the stats can actually matter. I think of all the cards banking on charts being good card advantage, Vista Painter is the one that most attempts to lure you into that trap. I don't think the effort is worth it. Now this is more like it. Blightstalker is a 2 mana 2/2 that can exile a card from a graveyard and gain you 1 life for a single green mana activation. And it gets a temporary +1/+1 boost for the turn whenever 1 or more cards leave your graveyard during your turn. As you might guess, the set has some leaves the graveyard synergies, and much like with the Flash package, it's a shame that this is entering the field as Uldun is leaving. But you don't need those synergies for Blightstalker to do work. In spite of how good graveyard interaction is getting, graveyard decks are also constantly getting new powerful tools. Just look at how well Envoy of the Fallen performed last month in spite of the popularity behind Crucible of the Burning Sun. Main deckable graveyard hate is increasingly becoming a necessity, and as far as creatures that can reliably hit on graveyards go, the only pre-existing one is Corpse Pyre Fiend, and that's got 4 months left on its clock. Now, Blightstalker steps into the ring with a similar goal, also capable of padding your life total a bit against aggressive matchups, and pushing a solid amount of damage if you use its ability on your own graveyard. I've been trying to find a good shell to pair with a Yeshi's Agent, and I think this and some of the other green tools could be what's missing. Prism catchers our first green Syzygy card, a 2-mana 1/3 with reach that can tap and let you pay 1 mana to add a mana of any color, though you could, of course, also just tap another creature. I don't think this will perform as well as Keenox Naturalist. Having to tap another creature for this to yield 1 mana does sting, but this can also be cast for 1 mana rather than 2, and you can even chain Prism Catchers together with relative ease by tapping the Summoning Sick one you just cast to reduce the cost of the next. If you can find reasons to care about having tapped creatures, maybe this could do work, and even without that, this does fix your mana rather reliably, even if just used as filtering. Keenox Leypillar is another of our defenders, a 0/3 that lets you mill 2 cards when it enters, and then return a permanent card milled by it to your hand. We've seen Reprieve be the runaway mechanic from Exalt of Twiltree over the last few months, even outperforming battles in regularity of their appearance. And Keenox Leypillar has been will be a new all-star card to include alongside them between the card selection and advantage the Leypillar provides, and the fact that all of the Reprieve cards and a lot of their usual accompaniments are permanents the Leypillar can put into your hand. One Night of Serenity is another one of those 2 mana to make a pair of 1/1 spells, this time doing so at sorcery speed. The big gain here, though, is that the creatures it makes get +1/+1 vigilance and haste for the turn if your life total is above your starting life. This is pretty evocative of Assemble the Mob, which cost 2 mana up until Blood Like Rivers got into Magic Set Editor Modern, and Assemble was a pretty big token spell for the time that it had in Standard, because it was 2 mana at the time. Revolt is a lot easier to bring online than One Night's Condition, though, especially since the decks that want this to exist in are likely to skew aggressive and not have time for life gain. And importantly, a lot of the best life gain effects are Soul Sisters style triggers, where the elves are not going to gain you the life to get the +1/+1 haste and vigilance until after One Night in Serenity has fully resolved. If nothing else, this gives green now 8 copies of Krenko's Command, so it's closer to being able to play token strategy without needing a second color, or definitely without needing a third. We have gotten closer to official Magic last rotation with the advent of our first Mana Dork, and now we take another step towards parity. Revolution finally has an unconditional rampant growth. Step Beyond isn't exactly a rampant growth, mind you. You don't get to choose the land that it gets, and in terms of execution, it functions more like a chart token because it just flips the next land from your deck into play, so you can't really fix your mana reliably. It's also got a more restrictive casting cost in double green mana, meaning you have to have a stable enough mana to make it work. So when you're colored screwed, it's not going to help, but no chart effect in the set can do that anyhow, and if you're keen on ramping your mana without exposing yourself to early removal, this is probably the best way to make that happen. Chasing Stars is our final chart token engine, this time coming down for 2 mana and doing nothing else immediately. Instead, its effects key off of you sacrificing permanents, granting you a chart token each time you sacrifice a non-token permanent, and a 4/4 bear each time you sacrifice your third permanent in a turn. I think between this and Keenox Naturalist, there is a really loud, really strong argument for black-green to start pushing towards Trinket Sacrifice again, with the tangible creatures they burn up yielding charts, and other value, while charts and berries help fuel the sack outlets and generate 4/4 bodies with Chasing Stars. It's not the most explosive set of synergies, but I think this is a strong reason to play green in any form of permanent sacrificing strategy. And I think it's the sacrifice shell I'll be trying early into the next season. It might finally be the way to get Realm Violator to do work. Potentially. You've heard of 2 mana for a pair of 1/1s, now get ready for 3 mana for a trio of 1/1s. Eloris the Pathfinder is a 1/1 with Flash that makes 2 additional elves when he enters. And whenever an opponent plays their own flash spells or instants on your turn, you punish them by making a spirit whose stats are always determined by the total number of creatures you control. Even without that last line of text, this is a solid curve topper for a go-wide green strategy. And I think it helps glue together those shells way better than either Ragtag Squad or One Night of Serenity can. Importantly, this is also another way for a single card to put 3 bodies in play. So alongside Survivors of the New World, we now have 8 cards you can fire off with Syra's Blade of Memory to get all 3 of her relevant abilities in one creature spell. Add in that Aloris and Syra are both legendary creatures, and this could be something with Throne of House Revelin, where, a green-white mid-range tokens shell with Throne starts coming into existence. Anhame Star Sower is our final Planeswalker of the review, a 1 green walker with 4 starting loyalty, a 0 and a -3 ability, and a passive landfall trigger to put a loyalty counter on her, the only way she actually gains loyalty. That 0 is rather simple. She just makes a chart token, meaning the real bulk of her strength is concentrated in that -3. She gives you an extra land drop for the turn and sets up a temporary trigger to make 1/1 spirits whenever a land you control enters that turn. The theory here is sound for sure, in that using that -3 immediately lets you set up 4 lands in play, 2 loyalty on Anhame, and a 1/1 on board to help protect her on curve. And from there, you could hope to keep her around for another activation and make chart tokens in the meanwhile. I think it's just a tad awkward overall, though, in that with no lands in play, her 0 makes you pay 2 mana to actually get a loyalty counter on her. And no lands in hand. You have to activate her 0 to get a loyalty counter on her and pay 2 mana. It's theoretically a good card, but I don't think I see her being worth the trouble, as has been the case for many of the fair chart token generators. Blightseer is up next, a 4-mana 3/5 with a trigger that fires off whenever 1 or more cards leave your graveyard during your turn while it's in play, as well as when it leaves your graveyard during your turn. If either of those conditions is met, it makes a 1/1 spirit with Wither that can't block. It's another piece to the puzzle between Blightstalker and Ayeshi's Agent. I have to imagine there's a way to truly get this package to hum by going as wide as you can possibly muster. But I'm not 100% on Blightseer. It could be a solid card with Chittering Gargantua and company as well, something you can discard to fuel the exile from graveyard effects in those shells while putting another body on board. Definitely a few avenues to consider, and all ones I'm known for liking, so it's a matter of time until I take Blightseer for a spin, but I'm not expecting great results. Sire of Greatness is a 4-mana 3/4 with Syzygy that can be tapped for 2 and a green to sacrifice another creature and search up something that costs 1 more right into play at sorcery speed. We've had plenty of riffs on Green Sun, Zenith, and company, but I think this is our first Birthing Pod variant that works with creatures rather than a different permanent type, repeatedly at least. Syzygy does wonders here for helping you get this into play earlier and then discount the activated ability, since you won't care about tapping the creature you're going to sacrifice, so it'll almost always at least cost 2 to activate. It's hard to say what decks will want this most, but I think this is another clean part of the fairer sacrifice shell we're seeing emerge from Solastere in black and green, and is another component I intend to push to its limits if I can. After all, you know how I am about cost-reducing creatures. Gorion Lacespire is the last Defender creature we have to talk about, and it's another solid utility tool in the rare slot. It's 3/5 for 2 green with Reach, and it destroys all artifacts and enchantments with mana value 3 or less when it enters. This pretty cleanly helps to replace Thunderous Avalanche, which has fallen off since its nerf, but has still been a strong anti-artifact sideboard tool. At a bare minimum, this represents a way to punish white decks for pinning their hopes on cheap enchantment-based removal. It cleans the clock off of any player leaning on Borrow, it wipes every chart and buried token off the board pretty cleanly. With the solid stat line and defensive ability in Reach, it'll likely be a real headache for folks trying to make headway with enchantment or artifact strategies, and it's the one big thing keeping me hesitant on how well the cheating form of chart shells could actually perform. Ravenous Stirrings is another weird one. Like a hybrid of Gifts Ungiven and Collected Company, this 3 and a green sorcery lets you search up for up to 4 creatures with unique names that each cost 3 or less mana, letting your opponent choose 2 to shuffle away while you get the other 2 on the battlefield. This presents a huge puzzle to be solved by you, as you need to have enough unique 3-mana creatures in your deck to make this worthwhile, while also accepting that the best of those creatures will seldom hit the battlefield. It's also pretty rough as far as creature tutors go, because any utility or hate piece you might want to search up becomes an easy choice for the opponent to deny you access to. So ultimately, you're better off running 2 to 3 copies of each of your key 3-mana creatures, and leaning on them being more generically solid to complicate the choices for the opponent. It's a fun puzzle for sure, but I don't think it's the kind of puzzle that will do much in the format. Breach Herald is our final Syzygy creature, coming in as a 4/4 with 4 and a green, both being its casting cost and the cost of its activated ability, which is effectively a chart token activation, but to find a creature instead, flipping the next creature from your deck into your hand and putting the rest away on the bottom in a random order. I think this might be the easiest syzygy card to evaluate for the entirety of the set because it feels the most like a traditional Convoke creature. Tap early creatures to rush out a decent stat line on the board, and rather than needing to lean on it for generic pressure, you can use bunches of tokens to help weave in Breach Herald's activated ability and keep the fuel coming. I think this could be worth the time as a 1 or 2 of in the green-white Cyrus shell I mentioned earlier, though it doesn't quite cover most of that deck's weaknesses. A bit of extra fuel alongside Survivors of the New World couldn't hurt, though, and even just at a fair rate, this is a turn 3 4/4 off of the usual 2-mana token-making suspects. Don't sleep on this one. I think it'll play better than it looks. Plaguebane Hulk is both our final green card and our final Lotus Spring generator, so it's time to talk about Cyhawk one final time. Plaguebane Hulk is a 5/5 for 5 with trample, and it destroys up to 1 target non-creature permanent whenever it enters or attacks, naturally replacing that permanent with a tapped Lotus Spring. So, this means Cyhawk can turn that trigger into a Stone Rain, blowing up any land, or blow up any other non-creature, non-land permanent to still get rid of it, and Cyhawk denies the token. While also meaning, There's also a niche interaction by way of Welding Rig, making something indestructible so that Hulk can pop one of your own permanents for a spring of your own without actually successfully destroying it. Realistically, I think the strongest of the Lotus Spring cards is right here before us, because it's the only case where I don't think Cyhawk matters. I think it's just a good trampling body for the cost, with a relevant trigger whose downside isn't that big of a deal and can be weaponized to turn disposable permanents on your board into additional mana sources. I have skipped ahead. I think this is the real deal among the Lotus Spring trio. It's the only one that won't care about Cyhawk rotating in just 4 more months, because it doesn't need Cyhawk to thrive. It's a fair card that does strong, fair things. Turns out, screw Cyhawk cheating this ability, just play the card. We've arrived at Multicolor, and we'll be breaking this section up into gold cards and hybrid cards, as I mentioned earlier. Starting us off, we've got Sunweaver Lysel, a 2-mana 2/2 with Vigilance that makes tapped an attacking token copy of another creature you control whenever she attacks, provided its mana value is less than or equal to the number of creatures you're attacking with. That token does go away at end of turn, but it's a decent amount of added pressure. It could play nicely with all the aggressive token copy effects we have out of Chikyu and Kitsuo, but I have a hard time convincing myself that this is a safe enough creature on board to justify building around. Advent Herald has a similar problem, another 2/2 for 2, but this time that only that stat line provided you choose... Oh, wow. I worded this really poorly in my script. But this time, it's only a 2/2, provided you choose to put a -1/-1 counter on it when it enters. From there, you can pay 1 mana, tap it, peel off that counter as a sorcery to double the entering triggers from your creatures for the turn. I think this fares better than Lysel by virtue of not needing to attack, and it also helps that one of the better enter triggers to copy up right now is, what a surprise, Contest Coordinator, which can find the Advent Herald. I have been thinking about how well Coordinator plays with the blue -1/-1 counter cards, and this is yet another case of that being true, so hey, we'll see if this gets played together. Cepheus Delugo is our first gold adventure card, an 8-mana 8/8 that taps or untaps another target non-land permanent whenever it attacks. The body is pretty good, but the adventure is pretty rough. The body's pretty rough, but the adventure is pretty good. I got that backwards. Path of Clarity is 1 in a white-blue hybrid for an instant that exiles target non-land permanent you own, then returns it to the battlefield under you control. We have enough history of type-agnostic flickers being really strong, but, I mean, we talked about it earlier. My biggest concern is that flickering Borrow in particular is pretty messed up. And this card is especially cruel with Borrow plus Zukar. Once again, permanent you own, meaning you can't flicker something you've stolen from the opponent, but much as true of the Errors in the Weft flickers, you can donate something to your opponent with Zukar, flicker it out of play, and if that permanent had a negative leaves the battlefield trigger, like the one on Borrow, you deal that out to the opponent and get the value back. It was at this slide of my script that I put my feedback in about Borrow to the curators, because I really don't like Borrow being able to be flickered constantly. I think it is a profoundly strong interaction to a degree that I think is unhealthy for the format. But we'll see if anything happens. Much like I said, I'd hate for Cepheus Delugo to be changed for this interaction, but I also wouldn't be shocked. I just think ultimately Borrow's the real criminal in all of this. Levicta Vizio is also an 8/8 for 8 mana, but this time its attack trigger lets you exile cards from the top of your deck until you flip a non-land card, then allows you to play those cards for the turn without paying their mana costs. This also means any additional copies of Vizio you flip into off the attack trigger can immediately hit the board and start churning out more value, while independently threatening 8 damage on each attack. I think if you're trying to scam adventure creatures into play, this is a really reasonable one to do with, and even better, the adventure spell here is just good removal. Path of Eminence is 1 a white and a blue for a sorcery that tucks target non-land permanent to its owner's library second from the top, meaning you get to delay an opposing threat while shielding your own from hand attack. I think this could be a really fair piece of the puzzle for bringing together the Divine Repurposing deck, by being both a stellar creature to flip into as well as a means of keeping the board under control. It's also nice that the attack trigger doesn't force the spell to be cast immediately, meaning that if you do flip into a Divine Repurposing, you have the entirety of your second main phase to gear up for that free polymorph, and you won't be forced into repurposing on attacks, so you still get to resolve all of your combat. Oblivion Dispatcher is very reminiscent of Reflector Mage, but I don't think that means we should anticipate a ban anytime soon. It's a 4-mana 2/4 angel with flying that returns up to 1 target creature an opponent controls to its owner's hand when it enters, while disabling spells with that name from being cast by that player until your next turn. Yes, of course, flicker and all, but I am unsurprisingly most excited about that type line. I am naturally still hard at work trying to figure out the best Radiant Devotee shells, and one of the biggest pleasures I've had with jamming it has been confirming just how strong using it to rush out angels that remove creatures can be for helping you keep the pressure on. Dispatcher offers us a reason to consider blue mana, and while we lack good blue soldiers to consider, and cheap blue angels like Chorus of One don't work as well with the mono white soldiers attempting to convoke it, I think the mana is good enough right now that attempting to splash blue for just Oblivion Dispatcher across Lucent Basin, Temple of Origins, maybe a couple copies of Distant Path, could be enough to make Dispatcher accessible without losing access to a reliable turn 3 Consume the Divine. On to blue-black, Lutra Inquisios is a 7-mana 7/8 that mills the player it attacks for a number of cards equal to the cards in their graveyard, creating a cascading effect for milling more each time it attacks, though it also just threatens lethal damage really fast with 7 power if it goes unblocked. The real appeal here is, of course, the adventure spell, as Path of Curiosity mills each player for 3 and allows you to rebuy one of the cards you milled for just 2 mana instant speed. It's less of a mill tool and more of a general control tool, a cheap enough card selecting cantrip that puts a finisher on layaway. It could be worth a couple copies of if you're looking to try and push in a blue-black control direction. Cloud of Consciousness is a 3-mana 3/1 elemental with flying that lets you look at each player's hand when it enters, allowing you to make both yourself and your opponent discard a non-land card of your choice, and then have each player that did draw a card to replace it. This is a particularly nasty effect to pair with Exorcist Errors in a blue-black mid-range or tempo shell, since they can collectively put in a ton of work to throw the opponent off balance. While this also helps smooth your draws as needed because it can replace a dead card in your hand. It's just a solid attacker for the cost. This is going to cause real headaches. Nether Invocation is a pretty interesting draw spell. For 4-mana instant speed, this always draws 1 card and then sets up a delayed modal trigger. You can either draw a second card from there, or have it deal damage to a creature or planeswalker and gain you life equal to the number of cards in your hand. This might be one of my favorite designs in the set as a whole, because it's just simple. It gives blue-black control a reliable removal spell to get ahead on the opponent, without being dead in cases where you don't have any great targets. 4-mana draw 2, I have been hyping up across the set review. It's honestly the biggest bummer that Uldun is rotating because of the blue-black flash tools probably loving something like this. Reconstructed Flare is a 2-mana 2/2 with Menace that can be cast from your graveyard if a player discarded a card this turn. It does exactly what you need to in black-red looters while giving you an endlessly renewable resource from your graveyard with any Ignited Soul or Puzzle Box token that's able to do its job. And it also does work with anything that makes your opponent discard instead. It's a simple, strong card. The only issue is that it's not the only 2-mana black-red spell aiming to slot into a looter's deck. Ignavis Imatus is a 7-mana 5/5 with flying, and when it dies or you discard it, you can cast it from your graveyard as an adventure until the end of your next turn. That adventure is Path of Absolution. 2 mana as a sorcery to make each player discard a card, drawing you a card afterwards if you discarded something. It's a stellar long-term value tool for looters in theory, since you can pitch it to a Puzzle Box or Ignited Soul and not even commit to playing Path of Absolution on that turn. I think ultimately Flare will be worth running in higher density, but Path of Absolution is a solid spell to loot away, even on an empty hand, for its ability to take a resource away from your opponent's hand from the graveyard, something that has been pretty strong over time. I do think there's merit for Ignavis Imatus in slower black-red decks as well, as a way to synergize with less explosive rummaging or looting effects. Or forget about explosive, Fabricated Anomaly is a perfectly fine mid-range tool as well. Psionic Backlash just keeps hammering in the hits for black-red looters, but this one could be a bit sketchy. It's also a 2-mana sorcery, this time doing a mandatory discard 2 to draw 2. That card selection comes with an additional effect, giving all creatures -1/-1 until end of turn for each non-land card you discarded with this. There is some clever sculpting you can set up here, killing off opposing blockers while shrinking your 2/3s down, and then getting free fabricated anomaly triggers off of them having 0 power. You can also plan around it by intentionally using it to junk 2 lands in a pinch, although that's a bit less appealing since that's card disadvantage with no added effect beyond replacing the cards in hand. The best use case, though, is that you can cast it as your final card in hand, meaning this just becomes 2 mana draw 2. The tricky part of this is that Solastere gives us another strong 2 mana draw 2 in this kind of shell in Manifest Not. But I could see Psionic Backlash squeezing into the main board, if nothing else, as something to replace Manifest with after game 1, as a solid anti-aggro mirror tool, and again, something that works well with Exorcist of Errors and Fabricated Anomaly in a pinch. Earthly Trifles is a big ol' bomb of an X spell to break up the looter cards. For X, a black and a red, this sorcery has each opponent reveal their hand and then tick up from 1 through whatever value you set X at. For each of those numbers, the opponent needs to discard a card or sacrifice a permanent of that mana value, or else they lose 3 life. With an empty hand and an empty board, this deals 3 damage for each mana you pay into X. It's one hell of a control finisher for any black-red high mana strategy, but I think it specifically works well with mana engines like Sustainable Investments, since you can just count up to numbers to a point where you just push too much mana into X for the opponent to keep discarding or sacrificing things. And if you're pairing this with other reasonable slow control tools, like, I don't know, Exorcist of Errors, you can predict what cards your opponent might have in hand to discard to this. Form of the Sun's our last black-red card, a 4-mana enchantment that gains you 10 life when it enters. From there, after your draw step each turn, you put 2 star counters on it, and then have it deal damage to a creature or planeswalker equal to the total number of star counters on it, at the catch of also damaging you for that amount. In theory, this is a decent removal engine that pads your life total by a significant amount, but not requiring a target for that second ability means on an empty board, this just starts killing you over time. By that merit, this could be a decent finisher to run with Zukar Null Champion as a way to pick off a few things from the opponent before setting them up for Oblivion once this reaches 4, 6, or even 8 star counters. It could be good in that context, but I don't know. It feels like another case where there's a piece missing from the equation, and I can't quite put my finger on it. Kicking off red and green, we have Cornus Asarai, a 9-mana 9/8 that makes defending players sacrifice 2 permanents whenever it attacks. It's a pretty nasty attack trigger, made up for by Path of Abundance being pretty underwhelming. But don't sleep on it just yet. That adventure is 1 in a red-green hybrid to just make a tapped treasure at instant speed. While Shigani Manor Burns is currently the king of this kind of effect, this comes with a far more terrifying sense of inevitability compared to a shock every 3 turns. Couple this with this being findable off of anything that selects for creatures, and the fact that this is more density of treasure generation for something like Sustainable Investment, with a meaningful ramp target to look at for investments at all, this could get a good amount of play. Probably not a bunch, but worth keeping it in mind. Wildermoon Compulsion is a red and a green for a sorcery that requires an additional cost of sacrificing an artifact or a creature, leaving behind a 4/4 bear token and drawing you a card. I spent a lot of words on the black-green grindy sacrifice shell, but Compulsion here makes a case for that deck being in Jund instead. Running black means you get to play both Newborn Oni and Omen Skulker. Sorry, running black and red means you get to play Newborn Oni and Omen Skulker rather than just the Skulker. And you get to run Devoted Lackeys as a way to turn Compulsion into a draw 2 that makes 2 4/4s. This could be the home that the recently buffed Frightyard Scrappers is looking for as well, since any 3-mana permanent can be flipped into a turn 4 7/7 with a really annoying ward cost and attack trigger, or you could cast the Scrappers for 5 off of a Devoted Lackeys and get 2 Scrappers instead. Ikosa of the Old Blood, it also looks to shake things up with the Sacrifice Shell as a 3-mana 1/3 with haste that makes a temporary attacking 2/1 spirit alongside her whenever she attacks. You can also sacrifice the other creatures to her, like the spirit she makes, to give her indestructible for the turn, tapping her as a slight downside to doing so. This is a pretty stellar sacrifice outlet, only ever feeling a little awkward for the existence of Envoy of the Fallen, who probably still reigns supreme as far as sack outlets go right now, but it's an infinite, repeatable sacrifice outlet for no mana. As far as potential Jund shells go, this means that Smiling Sludge is now on the train for Jund Sacrifice, since it not only triggers off of any trinket tokens you burn to other outlets, and not only brings a trinket token of its own, but can now gradually fire off from every other creature you have on board in rapid succession thanks to Akosa. Mataros Tyrannos is a greedy, grindy pivot for Gruul, an 8-mana 9/7 trampler that prevents all non-combat damage to be dealt to you and itself. Its adventure is Path of Ruin, a 3-mana sorcery that makes each opponent sacrifice 2 non-creature non-land permanents. It's a handy enough sideboard tool, but it's really awkward in the face of all of this trinket token generation in the format. Much as I was confused as to what to do with Form of the Sun besides the interaction with Zukar, this has me scratching my head all over again. This works well with Form of the Sun to strip away its drawback, provided your opponents can't kill it, and this also prevents a big terminal impact from cleaning your clock, regardless of whether you or your opponent is responsible for it, but I don't know. I'm not quite sure this is enough to glue it all together. Last Wish is a haymaker of a final spell to cover in red and green. For 6 mana, this sorcery lets you play a card from outside the game with a different name for the turn, and lets you untap up to 5 lands as well, making this functionally a 1-mana wish for something from your sideboard. That gets even better with something like the Nebulas, but I don't even think you need to build around Last Wish with your whole deck just for the sake of those 5 untapped lands. Rather, just run some solid mid-range and controlling bombs in the sideboard as one-ofs for Last Wish to find as needed. You can grab engines like Kefella or Aurora, a sweeper like Nillison's Leyspire, targeted removal like Terminal Impact, or even sideboard hate like Gorian Leyspire or Golden Bloom of the Silenced. Your options just get better as you consider additional colors, and I think it all adds up to this being one of the best top-end win conditions in the new format, and one I am definitely going to be spending some time thinking about. Oralith the Sunshard kicks off our Selesnya cards with an angel. Okay, gotta keep my head on straight here because this isn't that good with Devotee. Deep breaths, and let's focus in. For 2 mana, this 1/3 Angel Spirit has flying, lifelink, and an X-cost end-step trigger to make that many flying birds that, can't block. They can't talk either. And the caveat is that you can't pay more mana into X than you've gained life in the turn. The floor here is apparent. You swing your 1/3, gain 1 life, pay 1 mana, make a 1/1 for future attacks. It's very sluggish, and the big problem here comes down to just the fact that some of the best life gain effects in these colors, and the best rewards for doing so, and the best rewards for going wide, all depend on you actually going wide. Syra and company need the creatures entering to gain you life at all, and Rejuvenation Session wants you to spend mana on actually big permanents so it can gain you enough life in the first place. Oralith costs too much mana to make work, and the best enablers for her right now are just really mismatched. Soraeus Agosa is up next. It's a 7/10 for 8 mana that makes a 1/1 white spirit creature token for each point of damage it takes whenever it's dealt damage. I don't think that's very worthwhile, so the only appeal comes from Path of Endurance. It's a green and a white for an instant that prevents all damage that will be dealt this turn. We don't have many fogs right now, and a fog that affects everyone isn't always the best, but this does do one critical thing. It counters Terminal Impact. The best big burn spell in the field with this spell can't be countered as its first damn line of text. Tragically, I don't think that's a good enough reason to actually run Soraeus Agosa, but the reasons beyond that get a lot more lackluster, and it's nice to dream about a world where this keeps Terminal Impact in check, but that's not gonna happen. We're just gonna have to wait for 4 months. Cosmic Rebirth's a pretty huge reprint out of canon. For those unfamiliar, it's a 3-mana instant that lets you pick a permanent out of your graveyard and stick it directly into play if its mana value is 3 or less, or return it to your hand otherwise, all while gaining you 3 life in the process. It's not the most incredible thing in official standard by any measure, but Revolution has a history of these sorts of effects doing well. I'm not sure what the best things to bring back with it are right now, since this tends to prefer permanents with enter triggers so you can fire off from those effects on the opponent's turn. You could always cheat Borrow back in after the opponent removes it. The cutest interaction that I found with it so far is that you can use Rebirth to put Tsubasa Shigane into play on the opponent's turn, allowing him to block and protect one of your other blockers. It's cute, but probably not that good. I don't know. Green-blue is looking to play flash spells, and white here is not an unreasonable splash for that strategy, so it could be good there, especially since there are some good 3-mana creatures to get back with Cosmic Rebirth. Invasion Campaign is cool in theory and way too sluggish in reality. It's a 3-mana 3/2 of sorts, in that it's a 3-mana enchantment that makes a 3/2 token when it enters. From there, it returns to your hand whenever an artifact or enchantment you control with a different name enters. You could choose to not bounce it with that clause and instead keep it in play for more flicker effects, and I think that's probably stronger than actually recasting it, but it doesn't seem incredible either way. I can find 2 ways to do something funky as a bonus payoff to bouncing it, which is Aonuma Princely Traveler, which requires you to be in 4 colors and rewards you with a token copy of Invasion Campaign the first time you bounce it each turn, or Matter Harvester, which pays you off in an even worse fashion by making a 1/1 artifact creature when it leaves, which would be the thing you'd want it to do when it enters so you could pick it back up. If you do dare to play this, just flicker it, please. Waygate Bulwark is another 3-mana enchantment, this one keeping players from casting more than 1 spell in a turn, and coming with the passive end-step trigger to drain the opponent for 1 life. We do have a couple other Arcane Laboratory effects kicking around between Perils of Eternity and Illustrious Shang-Fa, but the former hasn't seen a ton of play, and the latter has definitely fallen off since his passive was changed to what it is now. The thing that makes Waygate Bulwark special is that the low cost comes with its own form of inevitability, meaning that you can get away with not taking many game actions beyond controlling the opponent's board and still kill your opponent as the turns run by. The thing that I think is most important is that it's 3 mana, so you can try and build this as a Revolt at the Palace shell, because when you and your opponent both can only cast 1 spell each turn, you can inevitably break parity with Revolt of the Palace. I think if Palace control can reemerge, this is going to be a major component of that plan. Cosmic Pilgrimage is yet another enchantment in this color pairing, and another one that drains your opponent for life over time, but it's probably a little less applicable. This one clocks in at 4 mana, exiles a non-land permanent until it leaves play, and drains at your first main phase rather than your end step, so ultimately doing so 1 full turn cycle slower. The end result is that this fights with so many other Banishing Light effects and struggles to make a lot of headway in that battle. The one big advantage of this, though, is that costing 4 mana means some of the better some of the better artifact and enchantment removal spells, like Hungry Blob and the new Gorion Leyspire, are actually unable to clear it. So if that winds up mattering, it could be the nudge Cosmic Pilgrimage needs. Umbris Surrectus is an 9-mana 9/9 that reanimates a creature from your graveyard, tapped and attacking whenever it attacks, potentially representing a ton of damage all at once. The 9 mana is a lot, so why not just discard 1 and use the second for Path of Awakening? It's a 5-mana adventure spell that just reanimates a creature from your graveyard. It's not obscenely broken by any measure, but it could be a nice 5th and 6th copy of the key reanimation spell for decks heading down the path of Reclaim the Fallen and Shigani Manor Burns. Those decks have been very heavy on black and red, but their best reason to lean aggressively on red is Vanishing with Audacious Rough Riders, so maybe it could be an excuse to splash in white. Shigani Manor Burns does help fix those colors after all. Lunar Awe brings us into the next color pairing. It's a 2-mana 3-damage burn spell for any target at instant speed that counters all activated and triggered abilities from whatever permanent it hits and strips that permanent's abilities until end of turn. This doesn't slip through Ward, unfortunately, and I can't find a ton of key death triggers on creatures you'd want to remove with this, but don't let that distract you from this just being 2-mana deal 3 with upside. I mean, this counters Planeswalker abilities on the stack, so when your opponent plays a Planeswalker and activates it immediately, you can still say no. Just in case Tamio looked really awful getting hit for 3 damage on turn 4 already. Now you can counter the loyalty ability that doesn't even do anything. Not to rag on Tamio or anything, I just think it's funny. Draconos Irakis is a 7-mana 4/7 flying dragon with a ward cost of 2 mana and 2 life. As usual, we need to look at Path of Hubris as being more important. It's a 2-mana instant that returns a spell you don't control to its owner's hand while dealing 2 damage to that player. Solid tempo spell, but at face value not the most exciting thing to do considering the long-term value's a bit unimpressive. The real appeal comes from the type line, of course, where it becomes an eligible sideboard card for Iviana Dragon Tamer, who also helps you float mana for Path of Hubris, or helps you ramp up to Draconos Irakis the following turn. There are better dragons to fetch with Iviana from this set, but I think this is a decent one at least, and when you can give this an additional ward 2 and haste, I don't know, it starts killing people pretty fast. Gomata Lumenos, meanwhile, is a 5/7 for 7 that can't be blocked if you cast a non-creature spell in the turn. It's not awful if you can slip it into play and keep it unblockable, but the adventure is what we're here for. Path of Reverie is a 2 and a blue-red hybrid instant that returns a non-creature, non-land card with mana value 3 or less from your graveyard to your hand. It's solid recursion for your key pieces of interaction, and if you can manage to reduce the cost on this, it becomes all the more effective. This buys back artifacts, enchantments, planeswalkers, and battles, so don't tunnel vision on instant sorceries here. Clash at Mistrit Vale, anyone? Lupensi Tyrannos is yet more recursion on a big adventure creature, with its Path of Dominion casting for 2 mana as an instant to pick up any permanent card from your graveyard to your hand. I'll be honest though, this is the rare case where I think the creature is the primary appeal. Lupensia itself is an 8 mana 8/7 that can't be blocked by tokens and returns any creature that dies after being damaged to it to play under your control, even if that creature trades with Lupensia Tyrannos. It's just a great card to cheat into play, as it bypasses the most common means of gumming up the board and snowballs away your opponent's resources from their side of the field to yours as they feel the need to jump block. If you can find a way to start cheating even just this or Rex Tyrannos or Umbus Surrectus into play, these could create an unbreakable barrier of massive attackers that slip other massive attackers into play over and over and just beat the opponent upside the head for huge amounts of damage. The trick's to figuring out how to get one of these on board in the first place and turn them sideways, and that might be a bit tricky, but I think if you're going to be cheating adventure creatures in, this is going to be the core, and you're going to try and figure out the way to make the colors work for you. Grave Prophet's a 3-mana 2/2 elf druid with a once per turn trigger on your turn, letting you draw a card and gain 1 life when a card leaves your graveyard. From there, it's got 4 mana activated ability to put a card from your graveyard to the bottom of your library at instant speed, or card from your opponent's graveyard into their bottom of their library. The only real appeal here is that draw clause, though I guess, as always, contest coordinator ability, weehoo. Either with the Ayeshi's agent package or in some sort of Sultai mecha plan, this does seem like a good way of keeping up value over time. We've seen a similar card in canon do good things, but admittedly that one costs 2 mana, is in blue-green, has flying, but hey, maybe this could work too, and this gains you life. Meteor Hellion is one hell of a mid-range card. For 4 mana, this 3/2 has a modal enter trigger to either destroy any non-land permanent with mana value 3 or less, or strip a non-land card with mana value 3 or less from an opponent's hand. A player's hand, even. You could just discard one of your own things if you want. This misses on stripping away adventure creatures, but that's the tiniest price to pay in the world for how flexible this is. Doesn't universally check the best cards in the format, but nearly every deck will have some cards that cost 3 mana or less, and Meteor Hellion will be waiting to end those cards' existences. Let's not kid ourselves. Eucus, however the hell you're supposed to pronounce it, I'm assuming that, Chrysaris, is a really rough 8-drop. The stats are fine, the trigger's fine, you just don't want 8 mana to yield this and nothing else. Path of Exoneration, on the other hand, is a sorcery speed lightning helix that can't target players. Those are 2 huge nerfs to lightning helix, don't get me wrong, but the question is, would you still play lightning helix anyways? And would you play a bad lightning helix that draws you an 8 mana limited bomb? Maybe. You can be the judge of that for your own decks. I don't want to say confidently no. I do at least try to cover Path of Exoneration, because completely ignoring it would be awkward when I have so much to say about Cleansing Starfire. This 3-mana enchantment allows you to put 3 -1/-1 counters on a creature when it enters, and once per turn you can gain an amount of life equal to the number of counters you put on a permanent. At its base rate, this is essentially just that same sorcery speed lightning helix that can hit fewer targets and at 1 more mana, in exchange for that damage being permanently affecting larger creatures. In practice, though, the additional copies mean you gain twice or 3 times as much life, and it's a permanent for any of the many things that might care, like Revolt of the Palace, Cosmic Rebirth, hell, even a Journey Begins. It's also flickerable, so things like Path of Clarity can reuse it for both the removal and also get a second life gain trigger from your Cleansing Starfire in the same turn. I think this is actually really good. It's one of the reasons why I think the type agnostic flickers could maybe stick around. I think this is a reasonable thing to flicker without it being too broken. Heavenly Descent, meanwhile, trades out that single target removal for mass -1/-1 counter mayhem. It's another enchantment, this time clocking in at 5 mana and putting a single -1/-1 counter on each creature when it enters. From there, at your end step, you can choose a counter on each permanent to copy up the given counter on that permanent, allowing you to shrink the opponent's creatures by -1/-1 again while leaving your board unharmed. It's also very flickerable, but I think it's better used for shenanigans with other kinds of counters. You can use it to juice up other permanents with funky counters that are normally locked in, or otherwise build up funky like synergies like Stella's Journal or Gilded Font. You could use it to progress through your time loop sagas faster, though it might cost you some value if you move to Shigani Manor Burn's second chapter. And of course, you can use it alongside Planeswalkers to pad their loyalty count totals, and get them to either further from death or closer to ultimates. No matter which way you slice it, this does some pretty funky value things with resources we seldom have access to manipulating in this manner. And hey, there's that land I mentioned back at the start of the review that would really appreciate getting its additional -1/-1 counters for added value from the mana base. As I've mentioned a couple times before, Green-Blue in Solastere is all about flash spells and instants, and we're kicking off this package's gold cards with a huge pickup for instant speed strategies across the format's history for the core rotation, and for Eternal play. Interstellar Sage is a nearly full Snapcaster mage, substituting the flashback granting with instead exiling the chosen card from your graveyard and letting you cast a copy of it. The bigger twist here, besides the more restrictive colored mana cost, is that it swaps out replaying sorceries for cards with flash, letting you rebuy utility creatures like Looming Psyhawk, value engines like Faithline Marshal, enchantments like Welkin Eviction, Gift of Stillness, other funky permanents like Advance of Rune and Whisper, or even Sylvia the Rewoven Oath. And of course, that's ignoring the very real functionality of just replaying your best instant speed removal spell, card advantage, or stack interaction spells. The more restrictive cost here is a tangible hit compared to Snapcaster Mage, but as is the departure of the black flash tools from Muldoon, but the Faithline Marshal-based flash shells already kind of looked solid as of late, and now it's getting a serious player here. I think Interstellar Sage is going to be a must-include of these flash decks. It might not be the single best card in the set, but I think it is up there. Speaking of new players in the Flash Avenue, Omen Mare is another solid contender that looks like a parallel to something we've seen play in canon out of something like Mystic Snake or Frilled Mystic. It's a 3/2 elk for 2 green and a blue with flash, and when it enters, you can choose to either counter a non-creature spell or destroy a non-creature non-land permanent. While far from the universal applicability of its canon counterparts and of its partner in crime, Interstellar Sage, Omen Mare is a really clean combination of 2 reactive tools that are each worth their salt in certain contexts. Negate's a reliable tool when you can find yourself up against low creature count strategies, and especially control. And Clash at Dawnbloom Grove is our only other real way to blow up any non-creature non-land permanent outside of the creature we talked about earlier, and Clash hasn't even had the privilege of seeing that much play as of yet. With these options merged into a single creature with relatively solid stats given the nature of its text box, I could see Omen Mare popping up in these flash decks as a real contender even just beyond the sideboard. Last for our proper gold cards is Soraeus Duplexi, an 8/8 dinosaur spirit for 8 that makes up to 1 land you control a copy of it each time it attacks. More relevantly, its adventure is Path of Fortune, a 4-mana draw to an instant speed that lets you put a land from your hand into play. Now, Reality Gyre didn't see a ton of play back when Karsus was around and kicking, but it did have some success in Epid's Hold to the Flame Shells at the start of 2023, and even appeared as a playset in Epid's second place list at GP Bergenon in January of 2023. Soraeus Duplexi comes with the added value of functionality, drawing you a 3rd card, technically. While the adventure creature here is as sluggish as Rezzed, having your adventure spell ramp you up to the creature can be a real plan to make it actually matter. Don't ask me why Primal Fisher's here. I think that might have been a mistake, but it's a 4-mana spell for Witchery. If you are one of the 2 people alive who thinks Witchery is good. Sorry, that was an unnecessary dig at Witchery. I just can't bring myself to have faith in it, guys. And gals and non-binary pals. Hybrid, here we come. Auroric Savior is a 3/3 angel for full 4 white-blue hybrid pips, and it comes in with a flying and an enter trigger, if you've cast it, to exile every single other non-token, non-land permanent in play, returning all of them to their owner's control at the beginning of the next end step. Importantly, this return is a delayed trigger, meaning you can counter it with anything that counters triggered abilities, and this also becomes a reasonable use of Aureola Crusaris by comboing its adventure with Savior for 5 mana, exiling all other non-token, non-land permanents for good. Oh, and here's a 3/3 flyer while you're at it. It's probably just a bit too janky to make really work, but this could be sweet. Worst case scenario, here we go, Blinking Borrow again. Precursor to Calamity, it flips to the complete opposite side of the coin. Forget your 4-mana board wipe-ish creature. Try a 4-drop that kills your opponent dead. For 4 black-red hybrid, this 4/4 with Menace, Haste, and Wither denies all life gain and damage prevention while it's in play. This thing hits like a truck and comes with a form of evasion to ensure it'll cause a lot of trouble for any opponent trying to preserve their precious life total. This is a crazy good top end for mono red aggressive strategies, but I also think it could be good as a curve topper for black mid-range. The inability to gain life is a bit more real there, but you can just lay on the pressure to back up your disruption. You might not need to care. The 4-mana all-hybrid pip rares just keep on coming. Invasive Progenitor is a 4-mana 3/4 beast that allows you to sacrifice any number of other creatures when it enters, creating that many 3/3 beasts in the process. Unfortunately, I do think it will struggle to see play, as other sacrifice enablers available to the colors are just a bit more reliable, but this does fire off a bunch of death triggers while replacing the bodies and often upgrading them, so maybe you can squeeze in as a 1 of tutor target for the new birthing pod creature. Calming Oryx gives us a glimpse of something lower mana value than 4. It's a 3 mana 4/4 for exclusively green-white hybrid, of course, that gains you 1 life whenever damage is dealt to it. It's unremarkable, but 3 mana 4/4s can be pretty good. It's increased density for green alongside Brutal Throat Crusher, and it's the first mono-white 4/4 for 3 we have, so if you care about the stats for the cause, you can't get much better, especially when it has no downside. Guiding Gladeheart, meanwhile, slips towards the cute end of the spectrum. It's a 2/2 for 4 green-white hybrid pips with Ward 2 and a first main phase trigger to make 2 1/1 spirits. So you get to start attacking with the things it makes 2 turns later. It's a bit too slow for me to have faith in, but it does get crazy if left unchecked. And hey, at least that ward cost helps protect it from most removal. Most removal, anyways. Okay, hear me out. Put down your pitchforks, just give me a second. It's an angel and a soldier at the same time. We have another in standard now. Yeah, there were already others besides Ambitious Angel and Tomer, but those were awkward 4-drops. There was an awkward 4-drop and an even more awkward 6-drop. Blinded Herald, meanwhile, is easily cast for its 2 white-black hybrid pips by just tapping 2 soldiers, and from there, it's an eligible candidate to convoke other angels and untap your board with Devotee. Beyond that, it's a 1/1 flyer for 2 with a weapon token created on enter, meaning you get a 2-mana equipment you can easily slide around with all that mana you're saving through Devotee, allowing your smallest threats to hit a little bit harder and allowing creatures after a board wipe to get threatening a little faster. It's just a solid card to pick up with reprieve effects like Softlight Harmonist as well, which is great considering the only strong thing to pick up before was a soldier that couldn't be convoked back out. This might in all honesty supplant Tomer purely because it helps drop the deck's curve. We'll see how much that matters for the strategy in the long term. Moonbeam's Artisan's a far less conspiratorial inclusion into this list. It's a 3/2 with lifelink for triple hybrid mana, and it searches your deck for an artifact or enchantment card with mana value 1 or less to put into your hand when it enters. Trinket Mage, eat your heart out. This finds you more types of cards while having better stats and a relevant keyword. You can grab a land drop with Warpway Rings, Graveyard Hate with Archival Storage, Multicolor Value with Golden Age, or a land drop again with Golden Age, any of the Ley Stones, removal like Planned Obsolescence and Scrap Weight, Planned Obsolescence and Scrap Weight. Stella's Journal becomes an ever more reliable draw engine. There's even the odd equipment like Majority Whip hanging out here and there. This thing reliably does enough that I think it could get into something like Green-White Welcome Eviction, where it can help keep Laystone of Being as being a relevant card, finding silver bullets elsewise, and hey, worth considering for Laystone of Being, that now cares about the amount of life you gain in the turn that it triggers. This has lifelink with 3 power. It is a valid hit off of Rejuvenation Session. This is a really good card. This is a really good card. I don't have more to say. This is a really good card. Find your silver bullets, find your engines, find your value, find your removal. It's good. Split the Sky has done the impossible. We have a blue Raise the Alarms. It's a proper one as well, since it's a pair of 1/1s for 2 mana at instant speed, costing a pair of blue-red hybrid mana specifically. I have no earthly idea what this will be good for. Maybe Syzygy costs? I don't know. I don't think blue needs this or wants this, but it exists now. Crackling Moonkite, meanwhile, is the real deal for blue-red. This triple hybrid Izzet Drake is a 2/3 with flying and prowess, and passively discounts your non-creature spells by 1 mana of any color rather than generic mana, but it can't reduce the costs to less than 1. Except it absolutely can if there are other discount effects that you can apply as well. Because you apply discounts in the order of your choosing, you can use a passive discount like Clash at Mistrit Vale, or a one-off discount like the clause on High Voltage, after you apply the Moonkite reduction to circumvent the restriction on that ability. Now, this could be a big deal courtesy of High Voltage having added consistency in Searing Grace, but realistically, I do think the hoops here are enough that it isn't just flat-out broken. I understand, as I understand it, this interaction wasn't on the designer's mind, but I think it's a happy accident that could enable some really cool strategies without being overly broken on its own. I'll definitely be brewing with it out of the gates, assuming it sticks around as it is. And I think it benefits everyone to know for sure whether or not this is a problem. I think it could be way safer than I think it is, but I think it could also be really cool. We know how people can feel about cheating on mana, though, so we'll see if it actually gets to get into the rotation as is. Psionic Sage is helping rep Is It more than the rest of the crowd here, since this is the only color pair where all 3 hybrid spells felt worth mentioning to me. It's a 4/5 for 4 that is very evocative of Builder of Monuments. Its enter and attack trigger lets you exile up to 1 instant or sorcery card from your graveyard, casting a copy of it for free if the spell's mana value is less than or equal to the number of cards it's exiled overall. This being an enter trigger is what gives it some potential, as you can immediately get value through a use of a 1-mana cantrip, a burn spell, or hell, even a haste enabling cantrip, and then start firing off free value on every attack. Despite the restrictive casting cost, this is a card I think you should look at with colors beyond just blue and red, because dipping out of Visit gives you access to things like Singularity or Search of Seizure if you're playing black. I struggled to find options worth recasting in green and white, unfortunately, but I'm sure other folks may have ideas that I missed, and there's Temur spellslinging support around from Cyberos for 4 more months if you can find a good way to make blue, red, green work. Ephemeral Leech is far more on the innocuous side. It's a 3/2 for 2 black-green hybrid that enters play tapped and lets you surveil 1 when it enters or dies. Nothing special, but it's for any aggressive self-mill strategy, this could be a respectable role player for the plan. I've played worse value generators for the sake of the cards they could put in the bin, so it's worth giving this the credit this could be due. Now here's a reason to fill up your yard. Putregoyf is quad black-green hybrid for a 0/1 with trample that gets +2/+2 for each card type in your graveyard, and when it leaves your graveyard during your turn, you mill 4 cards. Solid top end of a self-mill stompy strategy, but that mill clause is probably useless since there's no easy way of peeling it out of your graveyard yourself, since it costs 4 mana instead of 3, so your cheaper reanimation effects don't actually hit it. Having it exiled from the yard from your opponent's turn just completely disables this because the trigger doesn't work outside of your turn, so it's a shame that all we have to actually care about is the stats. But we have the 7 usual card types of creature, planeswalker, instant, sorcery, artifact, enchantment, and land, and for the next 5 seasons at least, we'll have access to battle, so it's possible for this to get as big as 16 power and 17 toughness if you can make the stars align and get all 8 card types in your graveyard. Moonscar Dominus isn't as special as some of the other hybrid cards, but it is a solid deterrent for blockers. For quad red-white hybrid, it's a 4/3 that makes it so any source an opponent controls damaging one of your creatures causes that same creature to bite them back for the same amount of damage. I can't really figure out if most go-wide strategies would care for this, but it really successfully invalidates creature combat for the opponent if your game plan is in any capacity aggressive. If not for the black-red hybrid rare, I'd honestly consider this for mono-red aggro, but it's probably best for tokens, and who knows if that deck wants to bother with this. Blind Visionary is a triple green blue 3/2 with flash that untaps up to 2 permanents at your end step. It's a perfectly reasonable creature for the strategy, but strangely enough, I think it's better to usually cast on your main phase than it is to cast on your opponent's turn at instant speed, unless you know your opponent's holding up a way to remove it. Because if you can untap 2 lands when you curve this out, it lets you keep up instants like Cursory Glance or Erase from existence without having to give up your 3-mana play for the turn. It also allows your higher cost instants earlier on in the game to be played, since a curved out Visionary allows you to float 2 mana at your end step and potentially cast a 6-mana instant or flash spell on turn 4, which could be Sylvia the Rewoven Oath or Stag of the Broken Crown. Might be a little unreliable given the strength of removal right now, but never underestimate your opponent's ability to leave their shields down. Finally, we arrive at Astraling, the new Control Mirror Killer. This 4-mana 4/4 has flash, it can't be countered, and it has 2 1-mana activated abilities, either allowing you to pump it up by +1/+1, or give it a keyword of your choice between Hexproof, Vigilance, Trample, or Reach, with both of those activated abilities being repeatable. This gives you an insane amount of sudden pressure as needed, being able to flash this out and then funnel excess mana as you need into Astraling for a bunch of damage, giving it Vigilance if you need to keep it up as a blocker, Trample if you want to overrun opposing blockers, Hexproof in the face of removal, and Reach if you're just holding back with it to block flying creatures. Couple in the fact that this 4/4 doesn't actually die to toughness-based board wipes if you have enough mana available, and like Nightfall and Millicent Lacespire don't really look like answers either, so this is poised to do a lot of work if you can keep it alive. We have arrived at our final section, and we're kicking things off here with Light-Pierced Envoy. It's a simple 1/1 for 1 artifact creature that makes a weapon when it dies, but there are 2 reasons we need to talk about it. First and foremost, That's a 1-mana artifact that makes another 1-mana artifact, so more fuel for your Sundering Fleets and Lightless Conquests. On top of that, its type blind has a word of pure dread. Golem. Unspeaking Titan and company have definitely been hurting since their last nerf, but make no mistake, they are always waiting for a chance to reawaken as major problems, and it only takes a little nudge. Astral Displacer is a crazy hate card targeted at cheap, repeatable spells. For 2 mana, this artifact chooses a non-land card name as it enters and taxes that spell to cost no less than 7 mana. Now, if I understand it correctly, this actually gets around cost reduction effects because it's worded similarly to Trinisphere out of Canon play, meaning if you name Welkin Eviction, no amount of cost reduction will save the opponent from having to pay full rebate to cast it. So if there's a particular spell you hate and your opponent's playing it for cheap, you can be a hater very loudly. Waypoint Armillary is another consideration for sacrifice synergies as a 2-mana chart that makes a tapped spirit token when it enters or is sacrificed. It's also, a chart, meaning you can just pop it for a land in a pinch. Not as exciting as some of the other fodder generators, but if it works, it works. All right. This is not a drill. I repeat, this is not a drill. We officially have the components necessary to play Persist combo in the current rotation. Meteoric Harvester is a 3-mana 3/2 with a death trigger to return it to play with a -1/-1 counter if it didn't have one, which is functionally the the Persist ability. Wow, that broke my brain for a second. I mentioned back during the Kitsuo review for this past May that while the odds were profoundly slim on it ever mattering, Eager Eelpup was in fact a means of enabling infinite sacrifices when used alongside a Persist creature. Well, if you want to try and live the dream now, we now have the A and B of the Persist combo roughly sketched out here. It's exponentially healthier for the format than the Eternal version was back at the height of its strength, and honestly healthier than the current iteration of it in Eternal is, owing largely to just how bad each of these cards looks on its own. But hey, I can make the combo come alive in the standard rotation. If you can pull it off, I give you my full respect, because it's going to require you to have Smiling Sludge and Akosa, or somehow play 4-color Envoy of the Fallen, Eager Eelpup, Meteoric Harvester. Either way, that sounds like hell, and best of luck to you if you want to try and make that dream come alive. Heraldic Ley Pillar is a 3-mana 1/4 defender that enters with a -1/-1 counter on it, and you can pay 2 and peel that counter off to tutor up any defender creature and put it into your hand. This is almost certainly too slow to see constructed play, but if you're trying to make the Prismatic Leyspire dream work, you could just, try and run this. And it also can help you find a specific hate card defender if you really want it. If nothing else, if people ever start playing Eternal Commander, this is going to be very real. Silenced Tomb players, rise up. Because, that is Tangle Call Nexus activating this for free, meaning you don't have to remove the -1/-1 counter, or even if you already have, you don't have to worry. You can just Tangle Call Nexus, tutor up another defender, spend mana of any color to cast it. You get 2 instances of that activated ability with Silenced Tomb in play. So yeah, if people ever start looking at Eternal Commander, which I'll be honest, I have, this could be really sweet with Silenced Tomb. Ooh, I dropped a thing that I was fiddling with because I have to stim because I have autism. Atomic Core has arrived to make a threat against the continued existence of Click. It's a 3-mana artifact that taps to put a charge counter on itself and can also tap to add mana for each charge counter on it. Most notably, that builds up to a tap and sacrifice ability, allowing Atomic Core to destroy everything in play with mana value equal to its charge counters. It's a gradually scaling mana rock, sure, but the Ratchet Bomb effect is the primary reason this will see play. The biggest advantage here is that you don't have to run it out in advance when hoping to clear tokens, but it's also just nice that you can pop this on your own terms rather than waiting for a 3-turn cycle to finish to decide if you want to sacrifice it after passing on the first opportunity. I think Click is still okay for the mana cost reasons, but Atomic Core just kind of knocks it into the dirt for the most part. Cosmolith is also a manalith, this time tapping for mana immediately, and possibly for 2 mana if you can spend it on a spell that costs at least 7 mana. This will work for cost-reducing spells, meaning that this can pay 2 mana for a Welkin Eviction, or even float 2 for a Frightyard Scrappers, that then sacrifices it to pay for 3 more. It's not obscene by any measure, but even in simpler terms, this allows you to hit your actual 7-mana spells on turn 5, which could be worth the trouble. I mentioned a non-creature card with Syzygy, and it has finally arrived. Edge of Null is a 4-mana equipment that equips for 4, giving the creature it's on +4/+2. The fact that this equipment asks you to be going wide makes it the one bright spot currently available for Nullblade Artisan. And listen, I don't think either of these cards are going to be amazing, but it is a soldier for Radiant Devotee. I had to say it. They prey upon each other in terms of how well you can pay their syzygy costs, and tapping creature for Nullblade Artisan's ability is also pointless for cheating in Edge of Null because it just winds up setting a cost on Edge to 3 and a white instead of 4 generic mana. Because you could just tap the Artisan to play Edge of Null anyways. If there's something to do with Artisan, I imagine the Titular Blade will show up, but I cannot imagine what that will actually look like. Maybe Devotee is where it belongs. I don't know if I'm optimistic, but +4/+2 on a flyer is very, very lethal, very fast. So maybe. I'll try it. Planetary Orrery certainly has the appearance of a future sight. So, Moonlight combo, yada yada. But this won't ever cheat your mana for you. Instead, this 4-mana legendary artifact lets you peek at the top card of your library and play lands off the top, so you can fix the top for its triggered ability, letting you reveal that card whenever you cast a spell from your hand if the top card costs less, and then put that card into your hand. This makes some pretty strict deck building requirements because you theoretically want to chain spells into new ones on top that cost exactly 1 less to maximize your reliability of any given card in your hand, resulting in this dictating a lot of your game actions rather than anything else that might be going on. It has all of the air of a strong value engine, but I can't for the life of me decide if I like this or hate it. The one thing that seems clear to me is because X-cost spells are a way to cheat it, you can, reliably get some use out of that. But beyond that, I think I'm throwing this one to you more accomplished brewers to see if there is anything to actually do with this. Not just a golem I'm not afraid to see, but an honest-to-goodness sad robot. We're getting Solemn Simulacrum reprinted from canon here, and I do think it could put in work. For folks that don't know Solemn Simulacrum, which we're in an offshoot niche community from the regular Magic the Gathering, in which Sad Robot's regarded as a pretty iconic classic commander card, so I'm not sure anyone needs me to explain this card, but I'm gonna anyways. It is a 4-mana 2/2 golem that searches up a basic land from your deck to play tapped when it enters, and allows you to draw a card if you want to when it dies. It's not an overpowered card by any definition of the word, but it's a solid little workhorse that could be worth getting for some value generation if you want to run it in tutor packages like for Venture Capitalist or Creation Mythos. And it's also just a reasonable 4-drop for any deck to consider if they think they'd want the ramp and the annoying little blocker. It's nice to get a little booster shot of nostalgia like this, and makes me want to brew a Commander deck in Eternal already, even if I don't know if this is a great card for Commander in official Magic these days. I like it still. I like it still. That's it. And maybe it'll be playable in Standard. I think I remember it doing some stuff in Standard the last time it was in official Magic, so that's cool. Okay, so Edge of Null wasn't the only equipment for Nullblade Artisan, as it turns out. Skyfall Sunderer is a 5-mana equipment that equips for 3. It enters and makes a 1/1 spirit that it attaches to, and it makes an additional spirit each time the equipped creature attacks, while scaling whatever wields it by +1/+1 for each other creature you control. Realistically, this is the reason to care about go-wide equipment, especially given that Nullblade Artisan and Edge of Null already ask you to do so for the discounts. Jamming a 1-mana Nullblade Artisan and then tapping it for a single white mana the following turn is a pretty sweet offer to jam Sunderer into play, but it feels startlingly fair for a chain in which I'm describing you cheating 3 mana in one turn and 4 in the subsequent. Could be solid, but I don't know. It might just be too awkward. Last but certainly not least, we end our review on Cosmic Lotus, a 7-mana legendary artifact that gains you 7 life when it enters, taps for 3 mana of any one color, and can be tapped by spending 3 mana to draw 3 cards. It's not the flashiest thing to ramp up to 7 for, but it does give you a reasonable late-game engine to reward all your ramp efforts, and the life gain doesn't hurt either. I'm not actually quite sure what to do with this, but we have untappers like Sylvia the Rewoven Oath, so maybe there's some big mana chains. Flickering this with any flicker that costs less than 3 mana yields you a mana and gains you 7 more life. It's hard to say for sure what this wants to do, but there's got to be something. And that, at long last, over 3 hours, concludes our comprehensive review of Solastere. As always, check out all of the links in the description if you want to do your own dive through the format and what we're gaining. In the meantime, take care of yourself. I'm going to go take care of myself, and I'll see you all in the Revolution chat. Bye-bye.